All right, welcome to hockeyprospect.com podcast. We just released our NHL Draft Black Book that is available on our website at hockeyprospect.com. The PDF version is available right now, and also the print version is now available on Amazon. If you have never seen our book, the print version looks like this. So if you want to learn about the NHL draft, this is a great tool to use. So for today's podcast, I'm joined by my good friend Brad Allen. Brad, how are you?
Hey everyone, doing well, doing very well now that the book is done. It's a relieving process to say the least. It's good to see the feedback too.
Yeah. So today's podcast is going to be all about goaltending, which Brad is a huge fan of scouting goalies, and so we're gonna talk about a lot of goalies today, because apparently we're the one of the fewer people that think that this draft for goalie is not as bad as people say it is. So um, if we people talk about this being a bad uh, goalie class. I'll show them what a bad goalie class is. Look back at the 2022 draft where this was not a good goalie class. Only really Dennis Ellerby looks like a really potential NHL goalie. There's some other guys like Sergei Marashev, Nicholas Koko are really in the maybe category of potential NHL goalie, but really it's one of the worst class we've seen and this year, we're pretty excited about this goalie class. In our book, we have our goalie list as 14 goalies, which is a lot compared to previous years where we had, I believe, 2022, we had 4 or 5 goalie on our list. And other years, it was usually around 7 or 8. Um, so maybe before talking about this class, let's go back to last year's class, which was a good class. We liked last year's class. We had 7 guys on our list last year. 5 of them went in round two. Michael Rabel, Adam Guyon, Trey Augustine, Damon Clara, Carson Bjarnason. In round three, we had Jacob Fowler, and Quentin Miller went in the fourth round. A year later, Brad, what's your maybe your take on last year goalie class with everything you've seen in the past basically 12 months?
Yeah, last year's class was really good. It was one of those classes that like the consensus thought it was a very good class, and it's turning out to be even better than I think the consensus felt, including us. Um, so last year we had Frabel, Guyan, Fowler, Clara, Augustine, I had Moysevich after that. Um, I didn't even talk about Bjornsson on last year's podcast. We actually forgot to do that. You're right. We did have him right there. So looking back, we have a year to reflect, year to see where these goalies are lying. So I would say that we did decent, pretty decent. So not great, but decent. So Adam Guyan is the big outlier here where we had him top two. We were a bit worried about the NAHL projection because the league is a bad league. And it's when you're dealing with a bad league, are you missing something because of the speed of the game and because the players aren't talented enough to show susceptibility on a goal? Right. And in Guyan's case, we thought we had enough questions answered from his U20 performance, but it turned out that this year he's definitely not looking like one of the top five kids in the draft and in net. So we got Guyan wrong, at least in year one. That does not mean it can't change. He's still a tremendous athlete, super gifted. He could easily come back up the list. It's just if you look at 1 year out, so far he's out of the top five. When it's Michael Hrabel, we had him as our top ranked goalie. I would rank him probably fourth now, and he still has the potential to go in the top three in a redraft in 5, 6 years. It's just he's very inconsistent mentally. He's been all over the map. In college, he's brilliant one game and then not so brilliant the next. So he just there's mental consistency issues that are still there with him, and that's okay. this happened with Sebastian Cossa, right? Everybody thought Sebastian Cossa was overdrafted, wasn't looking good, and then look what happened in the second half in the AHL this season with Grand Rapids, right? The Griffins, he was fantastic. He's looking like he was supposed to. Hrabal can do the same. So Hrabal still has that opportunity now. Where we did do really well was with Jacob Fowler. We were much further ahead than the NHL consensus elites because he was drafted in the third round. I think it was like in the 80s, wasn't it, Jerome? That he was drafted in Montreal, 70s, 80s. So
I believe it was 69.
69.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, just for 70. So we had him early 20s. We thought he was a third-ranked goalie. The big thing with Fowler was the physical growth rate. He was heavy set. So what happens when you get an opportunity to get him on a real nutrition program and he gets to lean out? Well, his lateral transfer rates will improve. And we thought if his lateral transfer rates would improve, he would look like one of the more top-end goalies in 2023 class, and that's what happened. So we hit Fowler, I think, perfectly. And then you look at our fourth spot, Damian Clara. Now, he was one, it's interesting because Jacob Fowler was liked more publicly, and the NHL liked him less. But then you look at Damian Clara, and it was the opposite. So Damian Clara, nobody publicly liked him but us. In the NHL, he was looked at quite a bit more. So I'm very happy with Damian Clara. I think in the redraft right now, Damian Clara is in the top three. I think it's Fowler, Clara, and I'll get to the last one there in a bit. But yeah, Damian Clara, phenomenal season. I got to see him play live in the Allsvenskan playoffs where he won the championship, got Brynäs to move up to the SHL. He just came over to the AHL now. I think Anaheim is looking to accelerate his development because I'm going to be honest, I didn't even think after the initial viewings in J20, like this kid's trajectory is unbelievable. If you look at him from where he played in the Austrian League, not the Austrian Pro League, but Austrian Junior. He was with Salzburg Red Bulls system. I saw him play in Italy internationally. He was very raw. And then in J20, first half of the season, he looked very interesting, but he looked like a project, right? Second half, he took off. We ranked him fourth as a result of that. We loved his athletic traits. And then he's accelerated his development in unbelievable pace now. So now he's really looking like something special. Trey Augustine came in at fifth for us. I think that's a very good spot for him still. I think in a redraft right now, he falls in 5, 6, 7, somewhere around there. And then for me, I had Pavel Moysevich. We're the only staff that had him written. We're the only staff that had him ranked. There's a bit of miscommunication in the book, but on our podcast last year, I discussed how he's our sixth-ranked goalie. So if you want to check out our 2023 final draft, you can check out the goalie section there where I talk about Pavel. I'll give you an updated interpretation of him today. The goalie I totally missed on, though, and it's the reason I can't give myself too good a grade on last year's draft, was Yegorov Zavragin. So this is a good scouting lesson for anybody listening to this who's interested in trying to learn how to scout the position. You have to factor in growth rate with goalies at a much higher level than you even do skaters. And that's why it's so tricky, especially when you're dealing with giants who are 6'5", 6'6", 6'7". But it also applies to smaller goalies or average size goalies like Jacob Fowler, like Yegorov Zavragin. So with Fowler, we thought he was overweight, and if he could slim down, the lateral transition rates would improve, and then he would look the part, and that's happened. With Yegorov Zavragin, he's one of the youngest goalies in the draft, and I didn't do it. I looked at him, I was like, he's too tankish, he's too heavy set, I don't like what I'm seeing, I didn't like his curve from last year, I didn't like his growth rate, and instead of giving him benefit of the doubt like I did Jacob Fowler and saying, hey, what happens if he gets conditioned? What happens if he gets to become more fluid and just more coordinated and dexterous, which he naturally should? Maybe you get something different. I didn't take that into consideration enough. I wrote him. I talked about how he just missed the mark for us, and I'm totally wrong. I'm so wrong. He's in a redraft right now, top 2 for me, arguably 1. So that's a massive miss for us and myself. But we did okay. We had Fowler, Clara, Moysevich. We're the only staff that have Moysevich. We had Augustine, I believe, in the right spot. Some of those goalies that were higher ranked, we had later, like Carson Bjornsson. I think we made the right move moving him back. So we did okay. We did okay. Not great, not bad, but we did okay. And hopefully Guyan and Hrabal can help our cause a bit longer term. So that summarizes the 2023 class. Now, to Jerome's point, we live on an island. We are alone. And so for some of you, I'm sure you're thinking, well, we just want to look a certain way, right? Everybody thinks this is a terrible goalie class. There's no good goalies. There's no standout goalies. And to be honest with you, it would be better for us if we could blend in a bit more because you don't want to be the outlier to get something wrong because everybody remembers that, right? But unfortunately for us, what happened was we identified pretty early a lot of high-end Russian talent that people had missed. Pavel Moysevich was one of them that we already were well aware of and had written and had ranked. And then there was other goalies that Jérôme and myself, we sweep Russia together. Obviously, we're crossover scouts. We have to sweep Russia because we can't go there live for obvious reasons. So when we're watching games together, sometimes a goalie will catch our eye. And we try to do that very early, and that's what happened this year. And because of that, we started feeling that this draft had a lot of sneaky goalie talent that just honestly people didn't seem to pick up on for whatever reason. Now, that might be because they're not actually very good and we're wrong. But the way we look at it is that there's sneaky depth here that people have just misunderstood or just didn't get an opportunity to see. And that happens. Goaltending is really, really hard to figure out. I mean, well, I just talked about how I just missed Yegorov of Rag, and he's probably one in a redraft right now. So it's really tough.
Yeah. So let's talk about this draft class. So in our book we have 14 guys ranked, but that's not enough. We're gonna talk about goalies that did not make the cut for that I guess top 14. So Brad, I know you have some goalie that you want to quickly mention that you like but did not make the final list in our goalie list. So I'll let you go with that.
Okay, so first off is Marko Bilic. He's a Canadian goalie playing for the Cushing Academy. I think he's going to go to the BCHL now and play with the Vernon Vipers, which is, I think, perfect for his development. Coming from high school, you want to go to a secondary junior league to just get the reps, start to adapt, see where you are. He is hyper athletic, one of the best transitional butterflies in this draft. He stands 6'2", 6'2 and a half. Exceptional kicking reflexes. He's incredibly competitive. Some of the best micro shuffle rates in this class. So there's a very good raw athletic base to work with. But as I just discussed with Adam Guyan, I'm looking at him from a lesser level. It's not now an NHL is a higher level than high school, but high school, it's incredibly difficult to really determine how Bilic is going to be able to calibrate, get square, and adapt to high-end shooters because there's just not many in high school. And there's too many times this season where I saw him swimming or he got caught out of position as a result of a skilled player folding hands over, faking a shot, turning into a lateral high dangerous pass, and he was out of position as a result of it, right? And so we're looking for certain situational plays that give us an understanding of his sense for the game, and that's where he appeared more average, and that's at the high school level. So there's only so far I can move a kid with that profile up, even though athletically he fits a lot of what you look for. In fact, for our listeners, he's actually pretty similar athletically to Eemil Vinni. Eemil Vinni is a heck of an athlete. This kid is very fluid, extremely explosive, excellent transfer rates. It's just very raw. So he's a dark horse player. Just missed our list. Honorable mention. I wrote him in the book for any of you who want to take a look. He might get drafted. It's going to be late, but he might get drafted, and a lot of potential. And then that brings us to Bor Glavic. This is a guy I've literally never seen written, discussed, never seen his name mentioned. He caught my eye in the Slovenian U19 league. I pretend that I don't scout it, but I do. It upsets Mark very much when I go to these second tier leagues because he thinks I'm always wasting my time. And admittedly, for the most part, he's right. But sometimes you find something. And Bor Glavic is what I hope that is. So Bor Glavic is 6'4", excellent base, really good curve in terms of growth rate when you compare him from last season. Some of you might know his name now, actually, I think about it, because he did play internationally at the U18 level. So there is some international competition that does give him a bit more of a profile that people know about. But to give an idea how difficult it is I mean, he went from the Slovenian U19 league, the Slovenian Pro League, to the Alps Hockey League, to international play. So Alps Hockey League, he looked overwhelmed. Slovenian U19, he was too good. So there's no middle. He's stuck in the middle ground for us. It's one of those situations where sometimes the goalie doesn't get in the right environment for us to know what to do with him. And part of that could be my limitations as a scout, and part of that probably is his environment. So he is athletically gifted, some of the best extension and lateral transfer rates. Sometimes a goalie is very good at pushing off, but then they lack the extensions. Other times goalies aren't very good at exploding out of the gate, but then they have very good extensions. Bor Glavic has both. So that's something you always look for is lateral transfer rates, lateral high danger passing setup plays. He theoretically projects to be able to deal with at a very high rate. I think the best way to describe where I am with Bor Glavic is if he was in the CHL, say he was in the OHL on a decent team, I think there's a very good chance people will be talking about him as a potential draft. I don't know if he gets picked, though, because of the situation he was in. But look for him next year if he's not, because if he comes over, very good chance that people start talking about him. That's Bor Glavic. The others are Sebastian Gatto and Hugo Laring. So with Sebastian Gatto, he's playing in the OJHL Leamington Flyers, prototypical size. He was a goalie that me and Jérôme both watched earlier in the season, weren't big fans of. But if you fast track to the end of the season, it's sometimes with these kids, just because of their age, that mechanically they're a little janky, a little awkward, and then they're growing into their frames as the season progresses, just naturally being the age they are, and then they look more fluid, they look more explosive, they look more coordinated, and that's what happened for us with Gatto. In Gatto's case, he is very raw, which is that's what happens with these types of goalies, raw, but they have the frames, they have the reflexes, they have the potential to be more than they present. But in OJHL, phenomenal in playoffs, extremely consistent. He looks definitely primed to play in the CHL. I think he'll do fine if he was in the OHL tomorrow. I think there's a chance he gets drafted this draft. Better chance than Glavic getting drafted. But if he doesn't, look for him next season. The last one is Hugo Laring. Now, Hugo Laring, probably one of the most unique situations in goaltending this year. And what I mean by that is I got an opportunity to talk to him at the U18, sit down with him and his father. I was asking if it was okay to talk about this publicly. They said it was fine. So what happened in his situation was he plays in one of the best systems in hockey, Frölunda, right? It's a renowned system, considered one of the best systems of all time. And unfortunately, his goalie coach had a falling out with the program with Frölunda, and he really was on his own. So, he when they asked me, his dad and Hugo, they asked me, "What do you think of this game?" I was very honest. I was like, "Listen, I'm going to be honest. You are very raw. You have some athletic potential. You compete, but I'm confused." And then I was like, "What's going on technically? What's happened here?" And that's when they explained to me, "We didn't have a goalie coach." If that's true, which certainly seems to be the case, that means that you have a very, very competitive 6'3". I know he's listed 6'2". He's not. I stood next to him. He's 6'3", 6'3" goalie who has a tremendous amount of raw potential, a tremendous amount of raw potential. So my comparison for him in terms of like what's going on with him is very similar to Vladimir Nikitin, who's a Kazakhstan goalie who just came to the BCHL, 7th rounder for Ottawa, and he plays like Patrick Waugh. That's a name you know really well, Jérôme. He really does play like he just comes right out of his net, and the spatial awareness is like it's gone, but it's gone by design. Just raw instincts, just trying to get in front of the puck at any point that they can, right? And so part of you love it because it's awesome to see a goalie cut down on angles, make windmill glove hand saves, and play the position almost on instinct. But then there's no fallback technique. So that Laring is very much in his infancy as a goalie, just like Vladimir Keaton. But if you look at the raw base, there's something to mold. So those are the 4 goalies for me that have a potential where people go, who is that? Where did they come from? Who might become something one day if things go right.
Yeah. All right. Well, now we're gonna go to our goalie list from 14 to number 1. And we'll start with Jan Kavan from Czechia. So that's a guy who went undrafted last season. And he's not someone who really made a lot of noise this year until around December. Like he was playing well in the Czechia Junior League, but you know, not many Czech kids playing in the Czech Junior League actually get drafted in the NHL. Like there's not many of them. So he really made a huge impression on us once he got called up to play in the Czech League on Brno. And I think that's when he really started making be more noticeable for scouts. Obviously the Czech league it's a good league. He posted some really good numbers, like just a bit shocking number to be honest. So like I said, he's a 2005 born goalie, second year eligible. which is not a big deal for goalies that are get passed over 1 year or a bit older. But like goalies, they take a lot of time to develop. So, I remember 2022, our first ranked goalie was Dennis Eldeby, and he was a fourth year eligible. And he looks like he's on track to be an NHL player in the next few years. So we don't care about the age of goalies, to be honest. And you're gonna see through this list that we have today, there's other guys that were passed over from a few drafts, at least one draft. There's even one player that was passed over 3 drafts before this year. So in Kavan case, we don't really care about him getting passed over last year. Um, I guess we wish he was a bit bigger. He's about 6'1", and but he played great in the Czechia League. He was great in the Czechia Junior League. Had a great playoff run there. Played fine internationally. So he's born the same year as Michael Rabel, so it might be tough for him to play, let's say, at the World Junior next year or big tournament like this. But we like him enough to be a 14 ranked goalie. Brad, what's your assessment on this Czechia goalie?
Well, I'm glad you brought up to start, Jerome, with the fact that we don't mind if a goalie's in his +1, +2, +3 over each season, because it goes back to what I just talked about with the growth curve. Sometimes a growth curve is so hard to determine with a goalie. Getting the extra games, the extra years, the extra data is super beneficial. And as you mentioned, Dennis Hildeby, we had him as our #1 ranked goalie, and we thought was a very bad class. And so far, so good on Dennis Hildeby. So that said, I missed on Hildeby initially, right? I didn't get him in his initial draft seasons, and the reason why is because the projected growth rate. I did not project him to be able to develop into what he did physically at that age. I kind of forgot about him, to be honest with you, in Timmer's system, and then he stormed out of the gates on me, and I was like, holy! And when he came to Farjestad, lights out. So that's what happens. So Jan Kavan, really, really strange situation. So I watched him early when he was playing in junior, and I didn't think much of him. He's one of those goalies. You look at him; he's 6.5 feet, 6'1", average to just say above average athlete. We wouldn't be talking about him, but not a super athlete like you'd want, right? Not the same athleticism as Carter George, for instance. Not that Carter George is a freak athlete, but Carter George is at least a good base of athleticism for 6'1". Not great, but good. And Kavan's just a bit under that. So he's talking about average to above average, depending on the category. So you're looking, you're like, this doesn't matter, right? Instantly, spidey sense, tingle, scouting sense, you're saying this isn't going to be a player that's going to matter to us long term whatsoever. And so I forgot about him. And as you mentioned, he gets called up to the Extra Liga. Pretty decent league. I think it's underrated league at this point. Everybody seems hating on Extra Liga. It's not that bad. There is some talent there. The Czechs are Czechia is super passionate country when it comes to hockey. It shows on the ice. There's always some developing talent there. So he gets called up in Cometo Burno's system. I'm expecting a cup of coffee. He'll get a game or two. He'll get sent back down. What did he put up, like a 932 flat save percentage? Over 10, 11 games. I've never seen a goalie at 18 years of age with the collective poise, the concentration, the consistency, the glove hand he displayed up there. I was like, well, okay, now I'm paying attention. So he carried that swagger and confidence from Extra Liga back down to junior, and he was just playing lights out hockey. I thought he does really remind me of Carter George. He's just a less athletically gifted, more consistent version with a slightly better glove. Now, does that play long term? That's why he's 14th, right? It's not too high on our list, but if you got a 7th-round pick and we don't have a goalie from the draft and everybody else is taken, Jan Kavan comes to mind where it's like, listen, he might beat the odds, because it's very rare to see a goalie at 18 do what he did in Extra Liga. He was so confident, always in control. He has ice in his veins. He reads the play very well. Very good situational reads. His lateral transfer rates improved. That's one of the big things with him. Again, not a total gifted athlete, so micro adjustment rates aren't that good. Lateral transfer rates aren't that good. Secondary save and recovery save options are not at the level you typically want to see. But if you don't have those, you need to be unbelievably focused. You need to be able to get square to the first shot, absorb pucks. He's got arguably one of the best gloves in the entire draft. He catches everything. So, okay, that's perfect, because that's contextually molded into the fabric of the game he has to develop. He knows that he can't be this hyper-reflexive goalie who just flies across the net after misinterpreting a play. It's not what he's going to be. So he has to see the play 2 steps ahead. He has to be able to be that goalie, processes so fast, the play slows down for him. That's what he is. So there's a chance that he makes it, but admittedly, it's a mild chance because he is 6'1" and not the best athlete.
All right. Well, our number 13 goalie on our list is Eemil Vinni out of Finland. He played this year in the Mestis League, which is the second men's pro league in Finland, which was good because he got some starts, he got some playing time, which it's something he probably would have not got in the Liga. So this is a goalie who has been hyped for, my goodness, 3 years, maybe 4 years. Like he's been on the scouting map for like a lot longer than most goalie that we're going to talk about today. And so he's a fun goalie. I think we enjoy watching him play because he's pretty chaotic in his crease, a bit crazy at time. He's very inconsistent. Um, he's a good athlete, but we wish he was a greater, like a great or even an elite athlete. We wish he was a bit better in that department. He's also, it's funny to say this, but he's only 6'2", so he's not a huge monster that we have like some 6'4", 6'5", 6'6" goalie. So he's not that. So yeah, he had a bit of a up and down year. I think he really didn't start the season well, but I think he got better as the season went on. Brad, what was your take on Eemil Vinni this year?
So hey, my take for Eemil Vinni is he's the litmus test of this class. So what I mean by that is that you look at him, you just aesthetically watch him, visually just watch him on the ice. Don't even worry about knowing the technical aspect of the position. You just watch him move. You watch some of the saves he can make, and then so I think a layman would be like, that looks like a potential goalie. Right? He looks like that. You look at him, 6'2". He's very athletic in some ways, very, very explosive, fluid. He's got some fast twitch in him, and he looks the part. And as you mentioned, he's the goalie who's been scouted the longest. So that's where you got to be very careful with that. See, goaltending is so tricky because you need way more viewings than you do for forwards or defensemen. But then you might get into a position where you might be over scouting if you get too many views, right? There's for me, over scouting is real. Some people don't think it's real. Some people do. I'm in the camp that I definitely think over scouting can happen. But at the goaltending position, in like 1 year of information, there's almost no such thing as too much. But once you get to 3 years, which is where we're at with Eemil Vinni, that's where things get a bit tricky. So I tried to take that into account in my evaluation because he does. He scares the heck out of me. I have a bias towards him from the outset, and I'll tell you why, is the last goalie that had an accelerated curve, that played in a pro league, and in a better pro league, he was bigger, and I thought he was projected to be better, was Jakub Skarek. And Jakub Skarek has burned a hole through my world. He is not going to play. He is the screensaver on my phone. So when I wake up, I can remind myself of how hard this is and how I can get things extremely wrong. Okay, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know everything about the position. I can't. I could tell you how many I got wrong, though. He's one of them. So with Eemil Vinni, when you have a 3-year base, you're looking for the curve to gain significant improvements each step. And if the curve is flatline, when did it flatline? How long has it been flatline? You mentioned from the get-go, Jérôme, consistency rates. That's a very, very critical aspect of this player. So when you go back 3 years from when he was playing, and just for our listeners, what we're talking about with accelerated development is that Eemil Vinni was playing U20 SARU level at 15. That is like unheard of. That is when you hear a 15-year-old playing at a U20 decent junior system in Europe, a U20 level, that means that you immediately have to go watch that player and figure out what's going on, right? Because that could be a home run, elite level goalie potentially. That hasn't happened. The reason why is because when you look at him at 15, you watch him at 16, you watch him at 17, you watch him this last year, the consistency rates have never improved. One game he looks like a bona fide NHL starter. The next he looks like he's going to get pulled after the five shots. And so it becomes incredibly difficult. We're not dealing with the physical evaluation that can't hold. We're dealing with the mental evaluation that's not holding. Now, I gave Jakub Skarek benefit of the doubt. The reason I gave Jakub Skarek benefit of the doubt in his draft season was because he was playing in Extraliga, which is a better league than Mestis, and because he was consistent at a higher rate than Eemil Vinni in his previous 2 seasons. So with Eemil Vinni, and because Skarek missed, I'm much more critical of this player than what you're going to see publicly. Publicly, you're going to see him top 3, 4, 5, 6 on most lists, if not first ranked. And it makes sense. 6'2", accelerated. Everybody knows him. Internationally proven to a degree. Hyper athletic in some areas in terms of transfer rates. Actually, let's break down his athleticism because I think it's a bit misunderstood. He's extremely reflexive. Extremely reflexive. So what that means is if he's in a butterfly and the puck is sailing past his butterfly and he has to reflexively kick out in time, even in a very in tight, high danger scenario, he can do it, right? That's very reflexive relative to his size. He's also incredibly fluid at transferring between save types. This means if he's in a reverse VH position, he can then go into a standing post integration position. Then he can immediately kneel back into reverse VH and explode across his net laterally. And it looks extremely fluid. Everything, it looks like a chain. It looks like a sequence that's fluid, makes sense, as opposed to a mechanical rawness where everything's rigid and there's almost one motion, 2 motions, 3 motions, 4 motions. Okay? So he has that ability. However, where he falls short in his athleticism is within his extension rates. So he sticks 2, but his extension rates fall into the Evan Gardner territory. And Evan Gardner is another goalie we'll talk about here in a bit. Both Evan Gardner and Eemil Vinni, their legs just aren't very long for their builds. Or their hip mobility locks their legs so they can't completely extend outward in like a full split and look comfortable. In fact, we've never seen Eemil Vinni enter a full split directly down the ice while remaining tall in net. This is something Carter George can do. It's something Ivan Yunin can do. It's what Timofei Obvintsev does every second shot. So there's certain goalies that can do this at a much higher rate, and it's incredibly important for translation. So if you have a goalie that's hyper athletic in some areas, but then his extension rates fall flat, what do you have to look for from an evaluation perspective? What you have to see is a goalie that operates very similar to Jan Kavan. A goalie who processes the play fast, knows how to keep his head on a swivel, knows when plays are in the dead areas of the ice, knows when an attacker can't actually shoot a puck on him, uses that opportunity to scan, mentally map the ice, and recognize backdoor passing plays, anticipating the play, right? In Eemil Vinni's case, one thing that's fascinating about him is if you look at how he operates when he scans, he overscans. So I think there's a sweet point to scanning habits. Some people think the faster that you keep a head rotation, the more you scan, the better. I think that's true to a point, but then there's a point where somebody's overcommitting to scanning because they can't anticipate the trajectory of the skating. I think that's what's happened with Eemil Vinni. I think that's one of the reasons he doesn't track as well as he theoretically should be able to. What can you do about it? This is where things get really difficult. You can tell a goalie when he's supposed to track. You can tell him, and he can learn it. He can use repetitions to know when to track. But there is a secondary instinct that comes naturally. And it comes down to processing ability. It comes down to be able to split second read and react behind a screen where I'm screened. I don't know where the puck is. I'm on a short side angle. When do I actually transition to the far side? Eemil Vinni's thought process for that would grade out as average, maybe below average. And I say maybe below because, as Jérôme mentioned, one of the other things with Eemil Vinni, and this applies, we just talked about Bor Glavic, Marko Bilic, Sebastian Gatto, it applies to Eemil Vinni too. Yes, he played in a pro league, but Jérôme, you know, we scouted. Mestis ain't a very good pro league. It's not up there. And what happens with Finnish goalies? Their shot rates are reduced. Finnish hockey in general has reduced shot rates. So what does that mean for us? It means he's in a bad pro league with reduced shot rates and he's not tracking well. Then you take the consistency rates we talked about the extension rates within the goalie, and it paints a picture of a goalie that I think gets overdrafted. And I think he's one of those case studies in the game where a lot of people are going to say, he looks the part, therefore draft him. And then you find out he didn't play. And then people go, well, I thought he was going to be, and he doesn't. And that's how we feel anyways. That's how I feel personally. That's how I think our staff feels about him. Jérôme, I know you feel the same way about this as well. So great glove hand, can make dynamic highlight reel saves, had starting potential, but you take the mental foundation, take the consistency rates, you take the extension rates, you take what happened with me and Jakub Skarek, and I have a bias, and I admit that. And that's where we're at. We're at Eemil Vinni, 13th on our list.
All right. Our 12th ranked goalie is actually a guy that I banged the table. Like I said, I want this guy on our list. His name is Samuel St-Hilaire from Sherbrooke in the QMJHL. So he's a great story. Late bloomer type of pick. I believe he was a ninth round pick in a Q draft. So if you get drafted in the ninth round in the Q draft, usually you don't play in the queue. So very rare that you're gonna find some, and even more so you find a guy in the ninth round that might get drafted in the NHL. That's a huge a huge credit to the Sherbrooke scout that found that player. So he went undrafted last year. He was a backup in Sherbrooke. In other podcast, me and Brad, we did mention that he was playing. We mentioned the number one goalie that was playing in front of him, Olivier Adam, that we had time for him at some point, but his play kind of like you know cool off last year, and I felt like Sherbrooke they went deep in the playoff, but in the semifinal they were up against Halifax in the series, and then Adam kind of like collapsed for them in that semifinal, and you know I you know I think there was a chance for them to still beat Halifax, but they didn't. I would have played Saint-Hilaire in that series after the first few game. I think he gives more confidence to his team. That's one of his quality. He does, and he's also a goalie capable of winning games on his own. So last year he was still like he plays as a backup. I didn't even know who he was, and then I remember I met a scout in OHL game in Ottawa, and he asked me about that goalie. I'm like, didn't see him. I've like he's a backup, so like really hard to get like viewing on a player that only plays as a backup. So, but at least that put him on my goalie radar. So he's an interesting player because he came back this year. I think he went to Boston training camp last year, and I think he did well there. And then came back this year, super confident. Start the year on fire. The first 3 months of the year, you can argue he was the MVP of the league. Um, Sherbrooke were supposed to be like a bottom five team in the league. They were rebuilding after going for it last year, right? Instead of being bottom five, they were top six in the league. And this was mainly because of Saint-Hilaire. Um, so he was kind of in my opinion, kind of the MVP of the league before the Christmas break. And then this is a guy who came out of a bit of a nowhere, makes Canada's World Junior team, only as a third goalie. But if you look at where he was a year or 2 years ago, like that's an incredible curve. And we often talk about progression curve of players and goalies. That's a one that really is major in my opinion. Um, you know, 2 years ago he gets drafted in the ninth round. Nobody even think he has, very unlikely that he's going to play in the queue, and now he's playing for Canada at the World Junior. Although, third goalie, but still, huge curve for him. Um, so he came back from the World Junior, and unfortunately, he got hurt, and he missed. I think he got hurt two different times in January and February. So he only played 4 games in those 2 months. Came back late in the year in March just to finish the year, and then play in a playoff round one. They beat Blainville Bob again in the first round, and then second round they play against a very good Drummondville team. And he got hurt after the first 2 games, but the first 2 games that he played in that series, he was unbelievable. Sherbrooke didn't really touch the puck in those 2 games. This was, all Drummondville. They lost both game obviously, but he kept the game close until the third, and he was, didn't do enough miracles in the third, but it was a very impressive performance by him. Unfortunately, I think the missed times in January, February hurt him a bit. Maybe that's gonna hurt him for the draft. I don't know. It's not like I think he's a high pick or anything like that, but I think as a 6 or 7 round pick as a goalie, I would I would be quite happy if I could get him in that range. He's a good athlete, similar to Vinny. Good athlete, but not great. So, and he has continued to grow. Like he came in the queue, he's around 6'1". Now he's listed at 6'2", which I feel like 6'2" is almost like the minimum NHL teams need now to
Gold standard. Yeah.
yeah.
Gold standard 6'3", 6'4".
So so yeah, he's a good athlete, but not an elite one. I really like how he reads the play. His post to post move agility, movement are really good. Extension rate, as Brad like to say, are I would say above average. Like is he's a good athlete. He covers the lower of the net pretty well. Um, but he's got to improve his play with traffic, um, with like shots from the points when there's a lot of traffic in front of net. Kind of be a bit he can struggle a bit with those at time. And he needs to stay healthy. Like that was two injury. I believe he got hurt last year too. If I maybe my memory is not like the best here, but anyway, so he got hurt twice this year, even another time in the playoff, I believe. So those are a bit concern for me, but I like the potential and I like what how he's progressing. He's going to be back in the queue next year. That will be his last year. Likely, good chance he gets traded next year in the queue. Um, so is he going to be an NHL goalie? Probably not, to be honest. But he has a chance. Like he has a chance. He's a hard worker. You see the improvement that he made over the last few years. Still has some improvement to make, like every goalie, but I kind of like the direction where his development is going. Um, and like I said, like if you can get a goalie like that is progressing late in the draft, I don't think it's a bad pick. Um, I think just the fact that he's now 6'2". That was one of the first thing one scout told me this year. Have you heard? I'm like, about what? He's like, he's 6'2" now. So um pretty interesting goalie. And we talk about with Kavan, like he's a he's a '04 player, like '04 born. So again, the age of the goalies don't really matter anymore. Like, I think people are starting to figure that out. Goalies always take longer to develop, and he's one of them. Moving on to your 11th ranked goalie. It's from the WHL, Saskatoon Blades, Evan Gardner. Um, he's an average size goalie. Does look a bit like Devon Levi in that. That's one thing Brad mentioned to me um, early on this season. So he played in front of a really good team in Saskatoon, which makes it a bit difficult for us scout. When a goalie plays on a really strong team, they don't really get like a ton of great A scoring chance. Kind of remind me of Sebastian Cossa in his draft year. Played with the Old King, and we love Cossa. Like we rank him really high, and we still really much like him. But it was a bit of a you know not a struggle, but a bit more challenging. And obviously, it was also the COVID year, so not many games to watch. So Gardner had a really strong season, um, but um, we have him 11. There's like before him, there's a series of smaller goalie that we're going to talk about. But Brad, what was your take on Garner this season?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying Jérôme had Devon Levi the highest out of anybody I've ever talked to. Like Jérôme was telling me about Devon Levi for years, even before his draft season. Jérôme brought up the fact he'd seen him live, and he blew his mind despite being smaller. So, yeah, pound to the table for Levi, and that's looking really good. Yeah, Evan Gardner, stylistically, there's some Levi. He's not as good an athlete as Levi, as we know, but there is definitely some stylistic comparison to be made there with Levi. So Evan Gardner is arguably, for me, the trickiest goalie in this class. I think this goalie is so hard to figure out. So on the one hand, he's not his listing at all. I was really hoping he'd be at the combine. I would love to know his actual height. I think he's 6.5 feet tall. It's very hard to gauge. Part of the reason hard to gauge is because he's always down in a blocker, paddle down style, transitioning in the pipes. So the best way to characterize this goalie is that, like Vinny, the extension rates are an enormous issue. However, unlike Vinny, Evan Gardner has adapted his entire game around knowing that. So what we mean by that is that because he knows that he doesn't have the kicking extensions that you typically want to see even a 6.5 foot goalie, he's adapted this style of play where he's almost always in a blocker down position and then shuffling in between save types. So he's taking away the lower part of the net area and he's sweeping across it and he's making his micro adjustment rate within that position. And it's like normally you'd say, okay, a smaller goalie who's doing this, that's not gonna work because he's just gonna have pucks elevated over him all the time. And for the most part, I would agree with everybody who would think that. However, he has one special trait, and that special trait has allowed him to not only do well, but to have a fantastic season, and that's his tracking ability. He is remarkable. Unlike Eemil Vinni, who isn't very good at tracking, Gardner is a phenomenal puck tracker at times. And one of the best ways we can determine puck tracking is when you have congestion, traffic in front of the net area. You're dealing with a powerful shot. It hits off 2-3 bodies, but then it stops on its way to the net. What's the goalie's position? Most goalies are already dropped into a butterfly. He doesn't. He is remarkable at recognizing when he actually needs to go into a butterfly or a paddle down position when he needs to remain in a set stance. That is not so dissimilar to Jesper Wallstedt. Jesper Wallstedt's gift to hockey isn't his athletic traits. It's not, I mean, the frame is good, but it's not the frame athletic traits. It's his tracking. One of the things Wallstedt did remarkably well in his drafter in the SHL was know when to actually drop in his butterfly during coverage. That is Gardner's ability. That was Wallstedt's ability. Now with Gardner, pretty good glove hand. I'd say his blocker side is also pretty technical. Not as technical as Carter George's or Leenders, but it's still completely fine. Most goalies nowadays have pretty good blocker sides because just all of them are so much more technically advanced than they used to be. And his rebound control on that side is good. But I bring up on that side because the rest of his rebound control can be very hit and miss. One thing that's weird about Evan Gardner is that despite being smaller, he doesn't manage his depth as well as you typically want. Normally, like extremely good tracking goalies, they manage their depth really well when they're smaller because they have to. Gardner can be very all over the map. Some games he's perfect with. Other games it's like, whoa, you're way too deep for this type of shooting scenario. What are you doing? You gotta come out. So it's almost like he plays like Henrik Lundqvist at times. Oh, Hank, like we're Hank, just on the goal line. And, Hank back then, it's 6'1" goalie, but he was super reflexive, incredible extension rate. So it was a bit different. But in terms of like playing the position very deep for a smaller frame, that's kind of what Gardner does. That's going to have to change. That has to be overhauled. That's not going to fly. So there's aspects to him systematically that need to be modified, but then there's other aspects that he's modified already that really helped him create this very unique game that's working. So yeah, not the greatest athlete. He can transfer from reverse VH and then cross over post to post, make highlight reel saves. We've seen it. I remember there's a glove windmill, save that we watched together, Jérôme, where he was in a paddle down position, reverse VH, and then just exploded across and took away the weak side one-time option. And it was one of those highlight reel saves. You're like, okay, if he can do that now, well, and then you expect him to get stronger, a little bigger, then maybe we really have something. So he's I'd say the other advanced aspect of him, actually, I'll definitely bring this up. One of the more advanced aspects of him, I should have brought up already, when it comes to his tracking, is his down low tracking around the net area. A lot of goalies in their first year eligibility, they'll overcommit, swing post to post. This is something Mikhail Yegorov does that we'll discuss, where he's not very good at tracking down low. He can mismanage which post he's supposed to be on, when to time it. That's not Evan Gardner. Evan Gardner is fantastic at syncing his transferring from post to post and syncing his reverse VH position relative to the skating trajectory of a player who's going behind his net area. So from low to high danger plays that where theoretically most players are susceptible, he's not as susceptible. So that's something he's gifted with. And he has to be because, again, not a very big goalie. It's something Kavan has to have. It's something Evan Gardner has to have. And Gardner has that. I have no idea where this goalie gets drafted. This is one of those wild card goalies for me, where he'd go anywhere from the 3rd round to the 7th round. I don't think he probably goes before that. But there's a lot to like. And for me personally, he's probably the goalie in a very unique and very interesting class that I'm most interested in seeing his development. What does he actually look like in 5 years relative to what he is now? Because he might be able to be that sneaky goalie we're talking about out of these kids, specifically Vinny, Kavan, St-Hilaire, where he's the one that surprises. He's the one in the tier range we have here, where he's a C grade goalie for us. So somewhere between 5th and 7th round, where in a couple of years everybody goes, that's the steal, because he has that potential just because of his mental evaluations of the game.
Yeah, a very interesting goalie, but very challenging to scout. Speaking of challenging, our 10th ranked goalie is Carter George, who won a gold medal with the Olinka team in August, U18 in just last April. So similar to Gardner, he's a smaller goalie. And I think Brad, people will probably wonder why we have him so low on our list. So let's try to explain this why Carter George is our 10th ranked goalie.
Before some of you close the video, just stay with me. Okay, I'm trying to explain why Carter George is 10th and not 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or most people have him. So Carter George, I'll start off by saying I think that this is a result of mental reframing. So that's a term in scouting that I use to explain when you see a player that has been highlighted either internationally or in a playoff series where they've exceeded expectation, explode up rankings, and therefore everybody thinks all of a sudden like they're this elite prodigy at the position they're playing, right? And this happens. Goaltending, I brought this up with Mark Edwards, our overseer. He and he liked what I said about this, and that's this situation with Carter George doesn't look so different than with Zach Fucale. And don't get me wrong, I like Carter George more than Zach Fucale. I had no time for Zach Fucale as a goalie, despite the hype, despite the Canadian credentials, despite what he did in the queue. With the amount of games he won, despite all that, if you really peel back the layers, you drown out the noise, there was a very inconsistent player with average athletic tools, and I was not a fan. Now, again, Carter George, I like more, but Carter George is coming off a tremendous gold medal performance. I cannot deny that. Spectacular in that game, right? He's had some spectacular games throughout the season. One of his playoff performances was just as good as the gold medal game that we saw. He didn't win that game, but he was just as good. So, it's one of those situations where his peak performances are so good, and then he's Canadian, and then he's won gold, and then the hype machine comes. Here comes the media, right? And it's, this could be the next Carey Price, right? That's what happens. And it's not fair to the kid, but it's what happens. It's part of hockey, right? It's hockey media. So Carter George, 6'1", and true 6'1". And then when you look at his athletic rates, they are good, but they are not more than good. They're not dynamic. He's not a dynamic goalie at his size. So when you look at Devin Levi, UC Saros, you look at Alexander Georgiev, you look at Dustin Wolf, okay? You look at the smaller goalies who've come through systems recently. Well, Georgiev's a bit later, but more recently, such as Dustin Wolf or Devin Levi. You look at the athletic traits at their size relative to Carter George's. Carter George does not come close. That's one of the misconceptions, I think, of this player relative to the expectation. That does not mean he's not a good athlete. It just means he's not a dynamic or elite athlete like they were. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen Devin Levi and Dustin Wolf this year. They are two of the best goalie prospects in the game of hockey. I'm proud to say on our staff, we had both top 5. It's one of those situations where, to be honest with you, these types of goalies are mandated against. That's something that we haven't discussed publicly much, but we could, which is that at the goaltending position, if you're not over 6'2", 6'3", there's a mandate where you don't even look at them. Now, I think mandates can be extremely good in some cases, such as You're going to be more efficient as a staff. You're going to know what your staff, what you can and cannot get on a staff, right? There's some things that can be good about mandates, but there's also some things that can be very bad about mandates. And one of them is that you're going to miss on Dustin Wolf. You're going to miss on Devin Levi. And if you can grab them, and I mean, look where Calgary and Buffalo drafted them, right? So, Buffalo didn't draft them, but you know where they drafted. Florida, 7th round for Devin Levi, Calgary, 7th round pick. Look at them in a redraft now, right? So it could be a bit dangerous, but that's where Carter George falls in. My point in saying this is we are not alone. We are not the only staff that have Carter George near the 9, 10, 11 slot. And I'll even say further, I guarantee you there are staffs in the NHL that are mandated against this kid, and he's not even on their list. And that's okay. That's just part of the process. Everybody has their own philosophy of how to do this. And for Carter George, for us, he falls under the athletic expectations that we typically want to see if we're going to draft top 5. We were extremely high on Dustin Wolf and Devin Levi. I absolutely loved UC Saros in his draft year. I thought he was a bona fide star in the making. He's one of the reasons that in goaltending scouting, I tried to create and generate terms that would make sense for a smaller goalie, like micro adjustment rates. And what do they mean to position? Margin for error. What does margin for error mean for a smaller goalie relative to a bigger goalie? So when you look at Carter George, he is very similar to Yank Kavan. He is incredibly intelligent in some situational plays. He can still get caught, when a high skill player manipulates a shot into a lateral pass in a high danger situation. He can miss time backdoor reads occasionally, but he's a very intelligent goalie, tremendously poised, plays with ice in his veins. And again, look what he can do when the spotlight's on him in peak performances. He shows up. That really matters. So the mental foundation screams starter. What we think, though, is the physical foundation screams backup. Is there an in-between there? That's what we think we've done. We put him 10th because we think that that's the in-between slot. We recognize the starting potential mentally. We think people have over-exaggerated the athletic components. Now, let's break down some of those athletic components to make more sense of them. When you look at his reflexes, his kicking reflexes, they grade out as about average to above average. I would not characterize them more than that. Not good, not great, not exceptional, not elite. When you look at his extension rate, that's where he beats out Eemil Vinni and Evan Gardner. His extension rates are actually very good. He can do a full split comfortably and remain tall while transferring laterally. They can't. That matters. That's a plus for him. When you look at his glove hand, he's very dexterous. He has excellent mobility within his shoulder girdle. What does that mean? It means that he can make windmill saves at unique angles when he needs to catch gloves high. We have to weight that more heavily because he's 6'1". That means that he's going to be more susceptible there as a byproduct of his size. But what's even more unique about him is his set stance. He keeps his glove hand very tight to his body. I don't know if you can see this on video, but very tight. And what that does is it means when he's exploding down through the motion, it gives him extra leverage. So when he's coming up through it, he can really explode and snag pucks quickly. However, it means he presents more narrow. And if a goalie presents more narrow on the glove side, it means that shooters are more likely to determine that that's the shot type that makes sense. So the glove hand's super important to him. I love the dexterity in it. It allows him to hold despite having a set stance that makes shooters want to shoot on it more often. You look at the technical rebound control. His blocker rebound control is exceptional. He is very good in terms of his blocker mechanics. He knows how to deflect pucks. He knows how to ramp pucks. He knows how to put pucks in dead spots. His butterfly, however, is not as good, and he does not have as much control in his butterfly. One of the reasons why is because he has a style where he'll keep a crouch position and not enter a full butterfly when trying to figure out which side of players transferring their hands in tight to him in the net. This is what made him susceptible to this 5-hole specifically on breakaways that I'm sure some of you have seen. So there is a lot of good, and he can fully extend his and will post to post in a full split. He can do those things. However, his kicking reflexes keep him from being able to enter that full extension at the rate you typically want at that size. It also means that because there's a delay, there's a hesitation within the initial phase of him trying to enter a split position or enter a lateral transfer where he has to kick. It means that there's a delay, which makes him susceptible 5-hole, which is also something we've seen. So he's a good goalie prospect. He was lights out in some viewings. He won a gold medal. He's Canadian born. I get the hype to a degree. However, there is one other aspect of this that I think people have underestimated And that's the fact that when you look at Eric Comrie, you look at Michael DiPietro, they were also over scouted, over drafted, over everything. I did not like either. The reason that they were overdrafted is because they were the best goalie in their respective league. I cannot emphasize this point enough. It's something I've talked to Jérôme about. It's something I've talked to Mark about. A lot of other scouts, NHL scouts, I've talked to this about. Just because the goalie is the best in their league does not mean they are even close to the best goalie in the class, especially if it's a Canadian goalie. Our systems have not been very good in net. It's the opposite of what you typically want in a player. With a player, you want them in North America quickly. You want them in an OHL or WHL or QMJHL environment. When it comes to the goaltending position, I want them in Russia. I don't want them near the OHL. Don't put them in the OHL. I'll take college. But the best systems in hockey for goaltending are in Russia. And I'm not alone in this. I have talked to former goalies at the NHL level. I have talked to directors of scouting about this. I've talked to goaltending coaches about this. Most of them agree with me that Russia has the best systems in hockey for this position. And look no further to who's the best goalie right now in the playoffs, Jérôme? Sergei
Bob,
Bobrovsky.
yeah.
Bob is doing it. Who was the best before him? Who did he beat out? Igor Shesterkin. Okay. Now, I know Ilya Sorokin's had a down year. Ilya Sorokin's absolutely one of the best goalies in the world. He'll bounce back, right? My point is there's always Russians rotating throughout who's the best. Andrei Vasilevsky. It will never stop. It's just, I think that there's a Canadian factor here. It is not Carter George's fault. And I will say this too. I know we sound opinionated. We sound strong here. If I'm wrong, and the industry's got this right, and Carter George ends up just as good as Carey Price or even close to that, I will be the first to absolutely admit I'm wrong. I'll be the first to explain why. I'll break it down and tell you how wrong I am. And that's what I've tried to do with Yegor Zavragin. That's what we're trying to do when discussing Carter George, because I know for a lot of you listening, it's one of those situations you're like, how can you possibly have a kid who's ranked first, second, 10th?
Yeah. All right. At number 9, we have our third straight smaller average size goalie, Ryerson Leenders from Mississauga in the OHL. Quite honestly, we have had up and down with him this season. To be honest, sometimes he looked like probably a no draft for us, and other times he looked, pretty good to us, but it was a pretty up and down year for us with him. And now he's ahead of Carter George on the list, which was not something we had most of the season. What did you see with this goalie, Brad, and why is he ranked number 9?
Well, I'll start by saying it was incredibly tight. Like these rankings, this range. So the tier ranges we have you have Saarinen, Leenders, George, Gardner. Like they're all in a very similar tier range there. We have Gardner a little bit further back, but Leenders and George for us are in the exact same tier range, which means that we have flip-flopped on them a half dozen times. That's what that usually means. So yeah, very, very close. So I would say that Carter George is more technically refined in some areas. I mean, they both have very good blocker sides, but George is better in terms of his skating ability, specifically when integrating to his reverse H and how he pushes off from his posts. I would say that they both have excellent glove hands. One thing that Leenders is very gifted at is being able to catch pucks that are labeled for his ear, like right to the side of his head. That's a sweet spot for shooters to pick a high glove on goalies. Leenders is very dexterous, very good at contorting his shoulders so that he can actually just snare the puck at odd angles. So that's something he does very well. Again, Carter George does it well as too. They're different though. So in terms of differences, you look at Leenders, he presents wider. He presents a much bigger frame in the net, even though he's not bigger or not taller at least. He presents very well. So he presents very similarly to Georgiev. Alex Georgiev and him, very similar presentation. When you look at the T push-offs, how they skate in their large area skating, also he's very similar to Alex Georgiev. So, and I'm a fan of Georgiev, so I like the style in terms of the presentation he shows. One of the issues, again, with Carter George, we talked about it, but if you have a narrower set stance, it makes you look more susceptible in terms of players who are trying to pick the far side corners of the net on you because you're folding inward on yourself. So yeah, I like how Leenders presents more. He presents wider. What's more important, though, is that when he drops into his butterfly, he also presents a very wide butterfly. That's very important because he's not very big, 6.5 feet. He's got to be able to be as wide as possible to be able to hold, and he does that. So that's really put into the foundation of his game. The big thing with Leenders is I think when you look at the draft as a whole, some of these kids we haven't talked about, we'll get to, they're more specialist in certain areas, right? They have tremendous mechanics, more specialization. When you look at Leenders, I would say he's more of like a well-rounded, almost a Swiss Army knife goalie of this class, where there's no one standout skill, but everything grades from average to above average to good. So he's a pretty good puck dragger. He's pretty good at controlling his rebounds. He's pretty good with his consistency rates. He has a pretty good glove, pretty good. It just, you go right through, everything says, okay, this holds, this mechanic holds, this attribute holds, but then he's 6.5 feet tall, right? So there is a, just like Carter George, there is a chance for them to be a start. There is, but it's more limited than maybe the public consensus would believe because he's not a very gifted athlete. He's I'd say above average athlete. And then you look at him from a technical perspective, I'd say his skating base is under Carter George's and it's roughly average. If the skating can really come, then that's where Ryerson Leenders might be able to really go past the development curve we have for his expectations right now. So not a bad goalie by any stretch of the imagination, does everything pretty well. He has stood on his head at times too. And when he goes on streaks, he's one of those goalies that really goes on a run. So like at the beginning of the year, he went on a crazy run. He was not letting it, like he was stopping everything. He was phenomenal to start the season. Then he had a downward stretch, and then he had another one of those runs. And towards the later half, I thought he became more mentally dialed in, focused, and consistent on a game-to-game basis. And again, when you're dealing with a goalie that size, you absolutely must have a massive, massive rate of mental consistency in order to actually play as a potential pro starter. So he's a very unique one, and he falls in the Gardner category for me, where the heck does he get drafted? No idea. Could go anywhere from round 3 to 7 to me. So they're very interested to see where he goes on draft day.
Okay, well, let's move on to our 8th ranked goalie. We go back to Russia with Ivan Yunin, a goalie that is not really well known. Not many games to watch out of him this year, kind of similar to Pavel Moysevich last year, where we didn't really add lots of viewing. So low on viewings on Yunin. But we still rank him at 8. I think we see a bit more potential than maybe the other goalies that we just talked about. So it's a bit a reason why, even with the low viewings that we have on him compared to the other guys, we see like the potential to be pretty good with this goalie, and he's also not 6 feet. So Brad, tell me about Ivan Yunin.
Yeah, you just mentioned not 6 feet. I wonder what he is too. We don't have a real listing. I think he's 6'1.5". I could be wrong. I think he's 6'1.5". I would love to get him to 6'2", 6'3". He's young, so there's time. He's still 17. One of the younger goalies in this class. So Ivan Yunin is impossible to actually evaluate properly. Okay, so just full disclaimer. Yes, we have him top 8, and like Jérôme said, I think you take the dark. Like, who's the actual real dark horse of this tier range? It's this kid. This kid has the potential to be top 3, 4 in a redraft, no problem, by as soon as next season. And I won't be shocked if it's the case. I'll probably look back and say, oh, I should have yelled to get him moved up a bit higher. But we'll take 8 because our situation was almost impossible to scout him in. He plays an OMSK system, which is one of the better MHL systems, but they very rarely play younger goalies. So he got 6 games this season, and this is where things get really difficult for me. I have a preference where I prefer a higher camera. I do not like closer to the ice level when it comes to evaluating goalies, unless I'm looking for skating and something specific in it that I can only see if I get closer to the ice. The specific, obviously, for video scouting, I'd obviously love to see him in person, but that's not possible considering where he was. So he played 1 game with a high camera this entire season. So I had 1 viewing where I actually felt comfortable evaluating. So that means for me, I had to go back. I had to go watch him when he was 16. I had to then let's just for a second try to get just how hard this is to do. I had to take the 16-year-old version of him that was playing in an system in the MHL. Then I have to try to contrast that with Eemil Vinni when he was playing U20 Saryu at 16, then look at Eemil Vinni's development rate in Mestis, and then try to contrast that with the theoretical development rate of Ivan Yunin. This is one of the examples of how unbelievably difficult this is to do. Right? This is not easy to do. If it was, a lot of people would be more right when it comes to this position. So the reason we have him aggressively ranked, the reason we think he's top 8, the reason I think he's probably that dark horse where in a redraft he might go way higher here is he has a ton of traits that you typically want to see. So for starters, stylistically, I mentioned this in the book. He reminds me a lot of Jonas Gustafsson at the same age. Gustafsson, who's now the Minnesota Wild starter. He's probably going to have to start splitting with Wallstedt soon. But Gustafsson is a goalie who's athletically gifted, but it's not really the hallmark of his foundation. More of it's the tracking, it's the situational reason, it's the ability to adjust to the shooter's initial instinct. And then if something chaotically happens around him, he can make a secondary adjustment and get back out front of it. Gustafsson is one of those goalies who's very cerebral and knows how to stay composed. Now, Ivan Yunin shares some of those traits, even at 16. And then the difference, though, is Ivan Yunin. We've talked about athleticism a lot today. We've talked about extension rates a lot. Ivan Yunin is a freak athlete. Ivan Yunin falls in the Adam Gajan category. Now, he's not as gifted as Gajan. He's not as big as Gajan, but he falls in the same category as Gajan athletically because he can enter a full split in 1 or 2 planes of motion and then enter a full split in the opposite direction after having to hold his inside edge. So what this means is, say that he's integrating into his post from a standing position. He's set to a shooter who's shooting on a low danger angle on the short side. That shooter then changes his shot into a lateral passing option that forces Yunin to make 2 different adjustments, right, that force him into the same plane as lateral pass. Ivan Yunin can do that in one motion and then enter a full split, and then say theoretically that shot attempt ends up becoming a passing option in the slot and he has to pull directions, go to another split. He can do that. He is one of only 2 goalies in this class that can do that. It's him and Timofei Obvintsev. Those are the only 2 goalies in this class that can, in one motion, systematically change multi-directional changes in tight to their net while in a set stance, and then laterally explode into a full split, hold the split, and come back in the opposite direction. That is freakish athleticism. It speaks to groin flexibility, but also speaks to the hip mobility. One thing that I'm sure some of your listeners are interested in is like, what can actually be improved here relative to what can't? I think that's something that's kind of missing when we talk about goaltending evaluation. One thing that really can't be improved, because it's just what you are, is your hip girdle. If I take, and I've done this, you take like Elvis Merzlikins when he was 17, and you take a video, you watch how he laterally kicks out, and then you watch him now, it's identical because your hip girdle does not change. You cannot mold your hip girdle. You can make yourself more flexible. You can give yourself a more dexterous hip line, but the way that you're going to kick out within your hip line is going to be the same. You can't change the hip girdle. So when you look at you and you look at Vince, this is a characteristic that can't be changed, and they have it at an elite level. So I always weight that extremely heavily when it comes to athleticism, and that's something Yunin presents. Ivan Yunin has some disadvantages relative to Leenders, George, and Eemil Vinni, and one of them is the glove. The glove is a bit more hit and miss. It's not as good a glove hand as they present, so that's a bit of a worry. His tracking rates are pretty good, but I would actually say they're under some of the top end in this class, like with just Jan Kavan, Carter George, Evan Gardner, better trackers than this kid. So Yunin's got some work to do in that regard. But make no mistake, like his numbers this year, like he was blown up in his last game, and it had like a 400 save percentage. It skewed his numbers entirely. Like his numbers were fantastic before he got blown up in his last viewing. Expect him to be a full-time starter in the NHL next year, and don't be shocked at all if he's the riser. There's a whole lot of Gustafsson in him, a Russian Philip Gustafsson. There's a whole lot of untapped potential, but admittedly, I'm limited because again, I had to deal with him at 16, and there was not much to work with this past season. So when you look at it from a curve perspective, he has one of the worst curves. And as Jérôme mentioned, curves are everything. Like the no curves are linear. Development of growth rate's nonlinear. You must be able to determine it. That's part of scouting. It's a huge part of scouting. Goaltending position's a huge part of scouting too. And admittedly, Ivan Yunin's curve was bad, and that's one of the reasons we left him a bit down here, despite the talent.
All right. At number 7, we go to Finland with Kim Saarinen, big size goalie, 6'4". Played some international games for Finland this year, but for some reason was not the starter at the U18 in April. He was and Brad, you were there at the U18, so I think you saw the one game that he played. I think it was
I got it.
against
Norway.
Norway. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was your, I mean, not just at the tournament, but what was your take about him all year and how he projects for the NHL?
Great question. So first of all, prototypical size, 6'4", about 100 and what, 185 pounds, which means a lot of room to fill out. That's what you want. And I bring up the physical base because this is the goalie with the most untapped rate of growth that could potentially be had. So when you look at him now, he's janky at times. He can be over the top of his center line a lot, so he looks imbalanced. One of the reasons for that is because his posterior chain is not fully developed, so he has trouble just pulling his shoulders back, keeping everything upright, right? So he's leaning over the top of himself. He folds himself inward. He's a bit narrow looking. He presents kind of awkward in net, and that awkwardness is compounded when you look at his skating base. He's a clunky skater. He's not a very coordinated skater. When you look at his post integration, both from a standing position and when he's going into a reverse VH, backing up into his net, into his crease area, he can have a lot of difficulty. What's interesting is he knows this. So instead of actually attempting to do it right and show technical foundation within the RVH position, he will enter a paddle down position that's not so dissimilar to Evan Gardner, and then just attempt to cheat by overlapping with the post instead of pushing off of it. So there's a whole lot of rawness in terms of how he integrates with his post, how he skates, and just his set stance, what he looks like, how he presents. However, you look at the ability of how he operates with his ability to manipulate himself off his center line. It's very good. What this means is when he's looking around a screen, he can look around a screen rapidly, still hold, and then be able to immediately move into, let's say it's a shot that's theoretically going weak side. He can immediately go off his center line and go far side off of the screen attempt. So there's like a good center line manipulation base to work with, despite being kind of janky, which I know sounds kind of strange to our listeners, but again, it's hard to kind of explain without video to show you at this time. But he has some raw athletic traits that, if he fills out, should significantly get better. And then you're looking at a completely different goalie, and that's the bet. That's what we have. We have him. What do we have him? Jerome 7? Like
7, yeah.
that's the bet. Yeah, that's the bet in your top 7. Is this isn't what you see is not what you get, right? And that's very different than the goalie we're about to talk about, that in Ilya Nabokov, right? Nabokov, we're looking at a finished product, and what does that mean? How do we just place that in the NHL? With Ilya Saarinen, or with Kim Saarinen, you're looking at a totally different type of evaluation. It's where can he get to maturation wise to hit that starting role. One thing I'll mention to our listeners, in the book I wrote in his profile, I messed up. I just reread it as a refresher, and I mentioned that his susceptibility is specifically his low glove. That is wrong. I wrote Marcus Gidlof and him back to back. That's Marcus Gidlof's susceptibility. Tim Sarinen's more susceptible on low blocker. And that has to do with coordination and how he extends out with his blocker. He's not very good. He's very susceptible right now to blocker side shots where he has to simultaneously kick out his pad and his blocker and seal. He can't do that right now. And that's what I'm talking about with betting on the growth rate. If he continues to fill out and get more physically developed, that should come, and then that's no longer going to be a problem, right? So that's one example of several I could give you where, okay, susceptible when he needs to integrate into his post and reverse VH position and then push across laterally, susceptible with his blocker side on full extension rates, but it's okay because once his frame catches up, the skating base should come, the small area skating around the net area should improve, and then his blocker side should also improve. So good base, extremely raw. You have to take more variables into consideration, which is why we have him a bit lower relative to probably the consensus. Usually the way we work at hockey prospect, and this is true of any prospect, let alone goalies, is the more variables you have to take into consideration, typically the lower we put them on a list, just because there's more risk induced within the pick, right? And that's where Kim Saarinen falls for us.
At number 6, you just mentioned his name. We have Ilya Nabokov, who is the oldest goalie we have listed. He's 21 years old. This is his 4th time being draft eligible. If he doesn't get drafted, which I don't think that's gonna happen, he would, to join the NHL team, he would have to be like signed as a free agent. But I think he will get finally drafted this year. So he's a small goalie, and he just finished his first season in the KHL. How did he do? Well, he won Rookie of the Year, and he won the KHL championship, and he was the MVP of the playoff. So not bad. Um, so the thing with him is that he had three great NHL season and never got close to be drafted. I feel. Obviously, he was overlooked by his size, but it's something me and Brad noticed, and we went and watched an old video of him in his first draft year, where his stance completely changed from today to to back then. And we were kind of like questioning ourselves, like, what, how do we miss this guy? Because he's pretty damn good. And then we watched those tapes and we're like, oh, that's why. Istanci made himself look really small in net and look like nothing like an NHL goalie in his, but he was still playing well. Like he doesn't know what a bad season is like, because this season and the first three NHL season he had, like, he was spectacular in all four season, but he I'm glad he met a goalie coach that made him change his goalie stance, because he had no chance to play in the NHL with that stance. And also people might wondering, why are you ranking him high and not the other smaller goalie? Um, Sometimes it's as simple as he's a great slash elite athlete compared to the other, like Gardner, Leenders, George. Like, if you look at Dustin Wolf, Josie Saros, Devin Levi, they all are great slash elite athlete. And I think Nabokov fits in that mold. Maybe not elite, but he's at least a great athlete. So Brad, what's your what's your assessment of this goalie? And last time we had like a fourth year eligible goalie on our list, Dennis Helleby. I mean, he went in the fourth round with Toronto, but they are totally different beasts. One is 6'6", and one is 6 feet. So
It's
what's your take
true.
on Nabokov?
I never even thought about it from that perspective, Jerome. But you're right. The last overager we had as a goalie is completely different. Like, you couldn't ask for a bigger contrast in styles. So, Ilya Nabokov, yeah. So, oh, you made a lot of good points there. So, I'll say this outright. So, I mentioned Eemil Vinni is like the case study for me in terms of drafting philosophy at the position. I think you look at him as visually and you go, that's got it. That he has a chance. Draft that. Type of thing. And if it doesn't pan out, maybe people have to modify their point of view about how to do this. And hey, I might be the one who has to really modify how I do this, because maybe even Vinny's a bona fide starter, and we'll find out, right? But the reason that this goalie Novakov's also a case study is for a different reason, but a very useful one, and that's that. What is the actual minimum threshold that a 6 foot goalie can play in the NHL in terms of athleticism? Right now, we have Levi, Wolf, Gorgiev, Saros. I think those are the four smallest goalies in the NHL right now, right? I think those are the ones. So, um, they're all freakish. They're all freakish. I would argue Devin Levi is the least freakish of those four mentioned. So that means, can Ilya Nabokov? He's not as freakish as Devin Levi. If Ilya Nabokov can get to a split starter role, does that mean it changes the interpretation of what actually could be an expected split starter, and maybe even a starter at the NHL level? That's the question. I don't have the answer, but we really like him. So Jerome mentioned the season. I think it was 42 games he played this season. I don't have it in front of me. I think it was 42 games. I watched the heck out of this goalie. He had 4 bad performances in 42 games. That was not including the playoffs, where he was absolutely unbelievable. So the consistency rate, which have to be unbelievable for this player to be talked about, are that. He is the margin for error. You always have to look for the margin for error for a tiny goalie. He's a tiny goalie. It's improved dramatically. Now, Jérôme also mentioned the set stance. This is a massive misconception in hockey, especially publicly. So I'll try to explain this. The way a goalie presents when they're 16 and 17 is never going to be the way they present at 24, 25. You always see a massive difference in terms of how they hold their glove, their blocker position, just how wide they keep their legs, right? Just how they hold their edges in their skating. Most of them get much better. I just mentioned the posterior chain in Saarinen. Most of them pull their shoulders back. They look wider. They present better. Everybody goes, "What happened? Why does he look so different?" Right? That's what happened to us with this goalie. And I'll listen. I'm not here to make excuses. Jérôme isn't either. We watched the heck out of Stalnia. We watched Ilya Yegorov, Nikita Grabenkin, who were the only staff that had him ranked, written. We watched the heck out of that program. We watched this kid. We just always thought he was a junior goalie because in his initial set stance, he was 5'6". He was so low to the ice. He was like a panther, just crouching along the ice surface, trying to get position. And to Jérôme's point, Jérôme mentioned how many years that he's played well. This is the single most consistent goalie since Dustin Wolf. Dustin Wolf is the most consistent goalie you will ever. Devin Levi, Dustin Wolf, these goalies have to be unbelievably consistent. They can't play, and they have been. This Ilya Nabokov has that. It's identical. He's been lights out every season. It does not matter the level. He's been lights out. Now, this is, Nabokov, again, case study for young scouts listening to this, or people who are interested in like how we try to interpret the position. Like, where I failed for our staff is that I should have watched him and then said in my head, wait, this will not be how he presents, so let's theoretically look at him if he was to present correctly. And I know for some of you, it's like, well, you got to take a big jump, right? And yes, it's more variable, so yes, you have to keep him lower, but it's a mistake by me is what I'm saying. And it's something you don't want to. If it happens, you got to learn from it. What you can learn from Ilya Nabokov is just because you see a 5'6" crouching panther on the ice surface who looks like a junior goalie doesn't mean he actually is one, because he's going to modify his set stance when he gets to the professional ranks. Exactly what he's done. So what has he done to modify his set stance? The first thing he did was pull himself way up higher. So when he's in standing position, he stands much taller, so he takes up more of the net. The second thing he did was broaden himself out, much in the same way that Ryerson Leenders does. He presents very wide, which he has to. Now, what's absolutely fascinating about his presentation in net is that when you have a smaller goalie, they need to be able to explode laterally at a very high rate because they're just not as long, right? They have to be able to get back in front of pucks. It means they have to push off so fast. However, it's much harder to push off at a faster rate unless you're already on the inside of your edge. If you're not on your inside edge and you're more on your neutral position on the ice or an outside edge, then it's much harder to push off. So theoretically, this goalie shouldn't have the lateral transfer rates he has because he has to present a wider set stance where he's not on his inside edges often, yet he does it really well. So what's happening? Why is it? Well, it just speaks to the freakishness of him. That's where he's athletically extremely strong. The other area that he's extremely strong is when we talk about micro adjustment rates. It's something I brought up, started talking about a lot in Yaroslav Askarov's draft year. That's where I presented what it's defined as to us. And simply for our new listeners, people who haven't read our books or what we do, micro adjustment rates are when a goalie misinterprets an initial shooting angle and has to adjust for that misinterpretation and then get back onto an angle that makes sense relative to the shot. So micro adjustment rates can be a goalie going from a butterfly position into a set stance and then making a micro shuffle, then going back into a butterfly and transitioning back out. And what you do is, or what we do is take the rate. So each save type equals one micro adjustment, and then you try to find out how many micro adjustments can be made in a given window of time. Typically, extremely athletic goalies can make 4 to 5 micro adjustments every 2 to 3 seconds. Ilya Nabokov falls in that category. That is absolutely critical, because if he didn't do that, that it would mean he'd be under the necessary range to be able to make an adjustment rates at his size in order to hold. So one thing that's super unique about Ilya Nabokov with his adjustment rates is when he is actually already in an extension position. So say he's making a kick-out reflexive save out of a butterfly, he can actually push off while still holding the same kicking motion and then explode outward towards his opponent to cut off the secondary angle. That's unique. That's where this goalie gets pretty crazy. Like, he can make some extremely unorthodox saves within his micro adjustment rates that are extremely rare. Like he's not Dustin Wolf levels are rare, but he's like past Devin Levi in some areas rare. Where Devin Levi hasn't beat though is lateral interpretation of a play. So when you're dealing with 3-on-2 rush scenarios, 2-on-1 scenarios, or scenarios where a player is exploding around the back of his net and doing low to high danger passes out to the slot area, this is where Nabokov can fail to track. Stelnia was very good defensively this season for him. And Stelnia, I felt like the staff did a very good job. Almost reminded me a little bit of how Barry Trotz works with Mitch Korn and the goalies. They build the system around their goalie so that they can operate in the way that their game will help them operate in. Like Robin Lehner, not that great in lateral transition. So what did Barry Trotz do? Made sure, and Mitch Korn made sure that they could cut that down, right? And that's so with Nabokov and Stelnia, I felt that they had the right system to cut down on his weakness, which has not yet been exploited. I bring that up because that might be the determining factor if he can play. If he can evaluate lateral high danger passing setups in 3-on-2 situations, 2-on-1 situations, low to high danger shots around the net area correctly, then he can play. If he can't do that at the rate needed, then he might not to. In his first year in the KHL, right through the playoffs, he still had trouble. It was not completely adapted or corrected for. That's where there's some limitation here. It's not just the fact he's 6 feet. It's not just the fact he's not as athletically gifted as Georgiev, Saros, or Wolf. It's that there are some lateral tracking errors. And again, that margin for error has to be unbelievably low in order for him to be able to play. So unbelievably interesting case study. No idea where he goes in the draft. He should get drafted. We think of him as a potential split starter, not a true full-time starter. But we're entering that split start. And to Jerome's point, when you're looking at a tier and it's tight and you have like Carter George, Ryerson Leenders, Ivan Yunin, this kid, you hope that Carter George, Ryerson Leenders can get to where Ilya Nabokov is. Nabokov just put together one of the best seasons ever. You hope they can get there. So we took a little bit of a gamble on a bit of a smaller goalie that's already there. And that might be wrong, but that's what we did. We just want to try to explain a bit of our ranking philosophy and why we did it.
Yeah, just to finish on him, one point that I made during the season is like, in 2 years, are we betting that Carter George, Linders, Gardner are going to have just a Nabokov-like season in their first AHL season? Because we can compare AHL and KHL together. Maybe some argue KHL is better, some argue AHL is better, but it doesn't matter. They're pretty close. Like, is Carter George, we're not asking obviously if they're going to win AHL playoff MVP. That's not the point, but just like having that type of season in their first pro year in the American Hockey League, I don't know. Like, I think it's a tough ask. And also prove that Nabokov just had a fantastic season, and also prove that he's not that far away from the NHL. Like he played great as a 20 years old in the KHL. If you give him 2 more seasons like this in the KHL, I think after that, I think he can challenge for NHL roster spot pretty soon after that. Again, he might just be a backup, or at best maybe a 1B, but we like this goalie. And this is a pretty remarkable season he just had, and I think he projects pretty well compared to the other goalies that are ranked after him. So we're pretty happy with his placement on our list. All right. We are now at number 5 on our goalie list, and we talked about Ivan Yunin being a really dark horse goalie. I think we got another one here in Timofei Obvintsev of Russia as well. This is not a goalie that has been mentioned pretty much anywhere. I think the only place that his name has appeared this year was on our list. In November, December, January, he's always been in our top 5 goalie ranking in every rankings we've done this year. This is a guy that went undrafted last year. Very interesting goalie, very entertaining goalie in his crease. Maybe the best blocker goalie that I've seen. Like his blocker is pretty impressive. Anyway, Brad, what's your I mean, we don't really know where he's going to get drafted. This is a bit of a
Bet that, yeah.
this is a dark horse that he's not on central scouting. He's not anywhere basically. So but he's a guy we like. We like his he's a good athlete. He's got size. And I don't know. We feel pretty good about him. But what was your assessment of him during the season?
I mean, just to catch on what you just said about where he might get drafted. When I first told Mark about this goalie, Mark Edwards, our again our overseer, I told him it's my favorite goalie in the draft. He's like, awesome. Where do you think he'll go? I was like, I don't know if he does. No, I've never seen his name mentioned, so we have no idea if he gets drafted. So, um, how do we even describe this goalie? So he is a part of CSK system, Red Army, very good system. What was interesting to me, so again, Jérôme and myself, we are international sweepers. We can't go to Russia, so we sometimes, we'll watch together. Late nights trying to watch some Russian hockey, trying to figure out some of these kids. Not an easy uh, what do we call it, league. Not an easy league to figure out. So one thing with the top teams though is there's almost always something, right? Almost always something on those top teams, and so we were looking for that something. And then this goalie let in a goal, but his viral transfer rates were phenomenal on the goal he let in. And I realized that I didn't know who he was. So I turned to Jérôme. I was like, Jérôme, hang on, go back. Let's watch that again. And I was like, okay. And so we watched it, and I was like, I don't think we know who that is. And that makes no sense because we watch CSK all the time. So we went back to last year trying to figure out what happened. Turned out this goalie had not really played. He only played 5 games his initial draft season. So basically, this was his rookie season, is what I'm trying to say. And for us who we watch CSK all the time, we didn't even know who he was. So fair enough. It makes sense that some people would miss him, right? Now he ended up becoming the third stringer on this team, even though it wasn't his first year of eligibility. He ended up becoming the 3 goalie, and he was at 6 games played. So we were entering the season with an Ivan Yunin type of nightmare on our hands, where it was like really like him, but our sample's so limited. But then fast forward, and what happened was a major injury occurred, and that allowed him an opportunity to get split starts, and then he took the net. And I say that because when you look at a goalie and there's no description of him online, there's no biases, nobody's swaying anything, there's no noise, and it's your initial interpretation. My initial interpretation was he should absolutely dominate the NHL. And it's because he's just too athletically gifted, toolkit's too good, he's too competitive. And as Jérôme mentioned, we'll break down in a bit, specialized, one of the best blockers you'll ever see. So it was like, okay, I think he's going to dominate. Let's see how he does. Then he doesn't get an opportunity. He comes back. How does he do? He dominated. He did exactly what I thought he could do. He had some incredible performances, putting up 40, 50 saves a night, standing on his head. And what's unique about him is he did it his own way. This is a goalie. With goaltending nowadays, you almost always have a goalie that's almost too technically refined when they're 17, 18 years of age. The instinct is gone. I'm sure some of you, a bit older listeners like ourselves, we're no spring chickens anymore. We're getting up there now. Like I just heard like Connor McDavid referred to Celebrini as a kid, and I was like, oh my god, this is getting scary quickly. Age is no joke. But like for those who grew up in the late '80s, early '90s, Pavel Bure's on the ice. You look at the goalies then: Tom Barrasso, Ed Belfour, Kirk McLean, Dominic Hasek. Right, the list goes on. What was beautiful about the game back then at this position was how many of them had their own style. They had their own way of doing things. They had their own feel. They had their own technique as well. Now, modern game, goalies are incredible. Do not get me wrong. They are unbelievable. If you put Andrei Vasilevsky in a time machine and put him back in 91, could you imagine? Could you imagine what that would look like? Holy, right? So they're spectacular, but it comes at a price. And that price is that people try to modify and create the technical foundation a bit too early, in my opinion. And so what happens is you get these goalies who all look the same. And then it's like Carter George is a phenomenal example of this, where he's technically very sound, but it's to a fault. In tight, high danger shots to the net, Carter George fails at times to open himself up. He can try to just get a limb in front of a puck. He'll just stay sealed even when he should. Spencer Knight, There's another example. Spencer Knight had this issue in his draft season. It happens more and more when it comes to this position at this age. This is where Timofei Obvintsev differentiates himself. Timofei Obvintsev is much more of this old school throwback with a completely his own style of play, and right now it works. Now, don't get me wrong. Will he have to heavily modify certain aspects of his technique in order to play? Absolutely, he will. He has to be able to modernize himself just like Hugo Laring. However, when you look at the raw base, he's a pretty good puck tracker. His situational reads aren't fantastic, but they're already solid within the NHL level. And then you look at the raw athletic tools, and they are the single best in this draft. There is no better athlete in this class. His extension rates are elite. He can do simultaneous full split, as I mentioned with Ivan Yunin, very similarly, where he can modify his hip line in one plane and get across. He has the ability to make remarkable blocker saves, which Jérôme was referring to earlier, where he could elevate and use his dexterous shoulders to just explode to the top corners of the net and almost like windmill cycle down pucks so that they become dead and he can just stop them in front of him. It's really remarkable to see. I hope I'm doing an okay job explaining what I mean. And when you look at his rate of recovery, it projects to be some of the best in the class. There is no goalie that can go from a fluid from a relaxed stance looking around a screen into a set stance, into a butterfly, transition out of that butterfly into an explosive kick save better than this goalie. He is the one that can do it the best. That's what really, the first time I saw him, he led in a goal, and I was like, that's something. There's something there. When you're not looking for it, that's when you know it's real, because it was, the athleticism was highlighted to that degree. It's not so dissimilar to Adam Guyan. When I watched him in the U20s, I watched one game of him, didn't know who he was, and I immediately messaged Mark Edwards. I said, Mark, we got a problem. Mark was like, what's the problem? I was like, there's an overager Slovakia, and he actually matters. And then Mark obviously laughed, and it turned out to be his favorite goalie of the draft, right? And that was Adam Guyan. So these freakish athletic goalies, they typically need more time for the technique to catch up to them. Doubly so if they're primarily relying on their instincts, which this kid is. So what I'm trying to say is he's the most raw and the most untapped goalie out of the top end, but he also presents the first range of our goalie list where we believe he could become a bona fide starter if given time. The other aspect, and I'll end on this, that's really unique about him, is he's a hybrid stand-up goalie. There is one of those in the NHL. There's no such thing as styles anymore. Well, what type of style is he? It used to be that Dominik Hasek had his own style, and then there was stand-up goalies, and then there was butterfly goalies, and there was all sorts of variations in between. This goalie is actually a hybrid stand-up goalie, and Alex Georgiev, for me, is the only hybrid stand-up goalie in the NHL. He's the only goalie in high danger saves in tight where he'll actually stay standing. This goalie will do the same thing. In order for that to translate correctly, it requires unbelievable reflexes. Now, with Georgiev, it makes some sense because he's shorter. With Timofei Obvintsev, he's 6'4". That's where I'm talking about with some of these modifications. He has a hybrid stand-up style now. It's going to have to be modified to a degree in order to make sense with given his frame. But it also is a throwback to the idea that he's doing his own thing, and I love it. So we love him, and I know for some of you, you're looking at this and like, oh, you just wanted somebody that's different. Right? We want to look a certain way. Nothing could be further from the truth because it's on me if I'm wrong. And I don't like being wrong at this position. It, as Jérôme knows, it keeps me up at night and I'm constantly sweating on my pillow, thinking about all my misses, and I'm pacing back and forth. So what I do. So yeah, Yegorov Reagan is going to haunt me for the rest of my life. I hope Timofei Obvintsev doesn't because I really, really like him. And I'm honestly just hoping that he gets drafted because for us, he really is a top 5 goalie. And I really think a bona fide potential starter if he's put in the right position to develop.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to our number 4 ranked goalie. And then this time we go to Sweden. Marcus Gidlof of Leksand, who play in the Swedish Junior League. Our biggest goalie on our list. He's listed at 6'6". He might not be done growing. He's a big boy. So sometimes we often talk about goalies that are too tall. So I kind of hope that he's done growing because there's not many 6'7" goalie in the NHL, and sometimes but it's going to be a long-term, it's a long-term, if you draft him, it's for a long-term potential because goalies of that size, it always take a lot more time. You see it with Sebastian Cossa right now. It takes more time. You have to be patient. Not every team is patient though. So, it would be interesting to see who actually draft him. Like compared to Obvintsev, we know this kid is gonna get drafted. And usually I would say probably the top three rounds, I would say. Um, but we still had some up and down with him during the year. But yeah, I think we finished strong in the second half of the season for us. He moved a few spots on our list. And Brad, what do you see as far as like long-term potential with this player, and your overall assessment of his season?
Yeah, so Marcus Gidlof, you're right, biggest goalie we have. So you think big now is seen as better in net, right? The bigger you are, the taller you are, that's awesome. There is definitely a cutoff point to that. Okay, so I think what's the biggest goalie that's like Ivan Fedotov is 6'7.5". I think Ben Bishop was like a legitimate 6'7". I think that's really the cutoff point because you look at Ivan Fedotov's game, it's just like when you're that big, your micro adjustment rates are going to decrease to a degree where you just can't play at the NHL level anymore. Your butterfly rates too, just to be able to transition correctly into a butterfly in time to be able to close your 5 hole is you're going to be very susceptible if you're over 6'6", right? So I bring this up because we do, Gavi here, just for our listeners, we do know player agent. We know who represents Skidlov, and the first thing he told me about Mark Skidlov is they don't even think he's come close to finishing development in terms of his height. They think he's actually still got another couple inches to grow based off his family tree. That's crazy. So he ends up 6'9" or something. I'll be honest with you, it's probably too big, and it might actually throw our projection out the window. We'll see. That said, there are some very useful gifts to this goaltender. So one thing is that his limbs, like sometimes you have a really tall kid, but their limbs aren't that long relative to their length. Like if you look at for MMA reference here, John Jones, for our listeners that know who that is, like he's not just 6'4", he has proportionally the most disproportionate limbs you'll ever see. His arms are unbelievable in terms of reach, right? Gidloff falls in that category where his limb length is insane. Like he has crazy arm extension rates and everything. So his extension rates overall exceptional, including his upper body, not just his lower. This goalie has okay. One thing I should say is that we've seen big goalies drafted high a lot recently, right? You look at Damian Clara, Michael Hrabal, Nikita Tolopilo was just signed as a free agent out of Vancouver, who has a real chance here. You look at goalies who've been solidified for a very long time, who are massive. Ben Bishop, who just recently, I think, retired or will. Jakob Markstrom, who's one of the better large goalies in the NHL right now. There is a level of athleticism that you typically want to see, even in their initial draft season, before you take their growth rate into consideration in order to think that they have starting potential. So Damian Clara, the reason we're so high on him, Michael Hrabal, the reason we're so high on him is because they were already very good athletes. They're super impressive athletes. Their growth rate from 16 to 17 was excellent. They look the part of what you want in a starter. I really think Hrabal actually looks a lot like Jakob Markstrom at times. So it's one of those situations where when you look at Marcus Gidlof, where does he fall in that range? And for me, he's well under that. He does not play anything like Damian Clara, Michael Hrabal, or even Nikita Tolopilo at the same age. He didn't play anything like them. So the reason that he plays so different is because he does not have the athleticism or the explosiveness that they do, and he does not have the skating coordination they do. And that's the massive factor. The small area skating coordination is not very good in Marcus Gidlof's game. You do not have to take that from me, though. It is actually literally how he has molded his game is through trying to correct for that limitation. And you can see that through how often he enters reverse VH position. In fact, out of any goalie I've tracked the last decade, this goalie goes into reverse VH position the most, which is extremely interesting. Why he's doing it is twofold. One, it's to counteract his skating limitations. And two, it's because he takes up so much room in reverse VH, he can get away with it. He's in a J20 system. He's in J20, which is a weak junior league. And then he is in a situation in J20 where he plays on a methodical, more defensive-minded team in Lexington. So you look at his raw stats, you look at him on paper, it's like 6'6", 200 pounds, and he has like a 923 save percentage, raw flat save percentage. Like, that's pretty impressive. That looks like the top guy on paper. Well, not so fast, right? the 6'6", not all 6'6" are created equal. He ain't Pavel Moysevich athletically, and then you look at the system he's in a system where he should succeed. Lexington's a defensive-minded system, slower-paced system. He should succeed there, and he did. Now, that doesn't mean he's not a good goalie prospect, though, or we wouldn't have him ranked where he is. He is incredibly intelligent. He reads the play very well. He showed a good curve in terms of athletic rates towards the end of the season. What that means is that they will hold. They won't be what he is known for. Damien Clare is going to be known to make ridiculous highlight reel saves, right? When he hits Anaheim full time. Michael Hrabal is going to be in between that. And then on the low end of the spectrum, something like Robin Lehner. He should be just above Robin Lehner, but he's going to be lower than those top end guys. So he can still micro adjust. He can still make impressive saves, but it's not what he's going to be. He's a blocking style goalie who's more cerebral, more intelligent. He knows how to get out in front of the first save. That said, he's going to have to heavily adjust his game. He's entering a reverse VH way too much, and that will come down to his skating mechanics. If he fixes his skating, he won't be entering a reverse VH as often as he does, and then that will allow him to optimize what he has available to him. The other aspect to this goalie is that in terms of consistency rates, he is very consistent for a larger goalie. Jérôme mentioned Sebastian Gatto is an example of this, right? When it comes to larger goalies, give them more time. They almost always need more time. Michael Hrabal is a perfect example where this past season, super up and down in his play. Gidlof actually showed a tremendous amount of mental consistency despite being so big. That's super unique. That's very rare. That's where I think he really shows more promise than some of these other larger goalies that, admittedly, we usually have ranked higher because we're into the massive super athletes. And he's not bad, but he is huge. So it's going to be very interesting to see where he goes. It's just everything comes down to him having abnormal weight transfers. He knocks the net off the moorings more than any other goalie I've ever seen. The net's flying every second play because he's always just crashing into his post because the weight transfers just aren't there yet, right? And that's okay. He's 6'6", 6'7". He's massive. It's going to take time. Don't be shocked at all. Jérôme mentioned this. Don't be shocked if he's the first goalie taken off at the draft, right? Again, I know for some of you listen to this still. Thank you for still listening to it. I know it's long. If Carter George, I guarantee you there's mandates against him at the NHL level. I absolutely promise you there are teams that have him as no draft. Those types of teams definitely don't have mandates against the 6'6" goal, right? And that's why it's so much more likely that they're just going to be drafted higher. So Gidlof, very interesting goalie. I think he's somewhere more Robin Lehner range than you would typically look at Jakob Markstrom athletically, and therefore he's a bit lower for us, but there's still a lot to like.
Yeah. All right, moving to our number 3 goalie, a Russian goalie, but actually one that plays in the USHL in America with the Alma Lancer, Mikhail Yegorov. With him this year, we saw some up and down from him this season, but also not always his fault because he played in front of a really bad team. Alma didn't win a lot of games. They were outshot like crazy. But as scout, we don't really care because he was probably in a situation that it's like, well, we're gonna see if he's legit or not. Because we love to see goalies get, a lot of shot. Like it's completely useless for us as scout when we see a goalie getting 22 shot on net. With Yegorov, we were getting 42 shot pretty much every game. So we like that. We love his size at the combine. He was one of the few goalie at the combine. There was not many goalie at the combine, so it's a good indication that he's going to go high. We talk about Gidlof. I think if Gidlof doesn't go number 1 in the draft, I think Yegorov could be a guy that goes number 1. Also, a lot of people were raving about his interviews. So he looks like a really good kid, speaks pretty good English already. And he's a good athlete. Maybe the glove is a bit of a weaker element in his in his skill, in his goalie skill. So again, good athlete, 6'5". Maybe the glove needs some work there. Brad, what was your take on Yegorov this season with the Alma Lancer?
Yeah, so I'll start off by just following up what you said. What an amazing kid. His interviews were incredible. So I try to be like, I remember talking to an executive about this. Like, there is no more dangerous process than the interview process. Like, you don't want to. I really try to stay away from knowing what the kid's like off ice right until the end of the season, because I don't want any of that to bias me, because I know it will. And yeah, watching him though, I was like, oh, we got this right. This kid's going to develop. Like, what a fantastic kid off the ice. It takes a lot for somebody to want to come over from Russia to North America, adapt, speak English full time, come onto the smaller ice surface, go to the worst possible environment in terms of, like, he's going to be spacing 40, 50 shots, and he held fantastically. So I think, to be honest with you, he's a bit over scouted, like from what I've read online and how people interpret him is so I understand the idea that, like, okay, the more goals you see on a goalie, the more unlikely they are to play. But it's honestly not always true, right? It really depends on the environment. Dennis Hildeby in his draft year was lit on fire. He was in Timmer's system. He was in a terrible, terrible system in terms of, like, he was getting shelled, but he had the goods. It's just we didn't know it at the time. He put up like an 870 save percentage. We just didn't know at that time, right? I remember who's the goalie? It's Lucas Dosto. Just won the World Championships with Czechia. Lucas Dosto was lit on fire by the program at the U18 tournament we saw, and it's one game, right? And the problem is when the games stack up, right? You start, oh, there's too many holes, right? There's too many holes on. However, what you got to do in that situation is you look at Yegorov's game. How many of those goals are actually specifically on him, and why were they on him? And that's the tricky part. That's where you either gain in the evaluation or lose the evaluation entirely. So in Mikhail Yegorov's case, it was usually twofold. One is what Jérôme referred to, which is the glove side is weak. It's the most susceptible aspect of his game, specifically high glove. He can have difficulty doing what Ryerson Leenders, Carter George do really well, which is extend into the top corner of their net correctly, use windmill saves, shoulder-to-shoulder dexterity necessary. Yegorov hasn't displayed that at the rate we typically want to see, and it's one of the reasons we kept him a bit further back than our initial interpretation was. We thought, honestly, he'd run away with the first spot in the early goings of the season. The other aspect that you have to interpret and see if it's fixable, and admittedly, the glove might not be. It might not be fixable. It might be the issue. But the other one I think is much more fixable, and that has to do with this overlap positioning. So last year, one goalie, Jérôme and myself evaluated a lot. We decided to leave him off the list at the end of the year, but we did have him ranked initially. Calgary took him in the 6th round. That's Yegor Yegorov out of Dynamo's system. The issue with Yegor Yegorov is that he would always overextend in his overlap position, that then put him out of position for far side shooting placements. So he would let in goals he had no business letting in because he was overextending his crease and would lose his net, essentially. That is the issue with Mikhail Yegorov. The spatial awareness is very raw. Now, for some of you, I'm sure you think, well, U17 Russian hockey before he came over, right? Wasn't even in the MHL. If you're talking about U17 Russia, the USHL, like, it's night and day. And then you're taking the ice surface in consideration, well, it's night and day. So you look at the growth rate within his overlap positioning and his crease containment. The question comes down to, did it improve enough where you think it theoretically can hold for a starting position at the NHL level? And for us, we think the answer is yes. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't work to be done. His overlap is still not great. He will overextend on his post. He will put himself out of position, even though he thinks he's set and square. He's not. That does happen, and that is a red flag to a degree because it screams not the hockey sense, not the awareness you typically want to see in a starter. However, when you take the game-to-game rates into consideration, there were games where he was absolutely dialed in and did hold with his overlap position, did hold with how often he squared up correctly, did hold with his spatial awareness and his crease containment. So in those games that he held, now we draw back and look at the rest of his game. What did it present? Well, he has a phenomenal butterfly. It's everything's sealed. He's very athletic. He's very tall. That's something that a lot of goalies, when you see them younger, what happens is that when they're in their butterfly, they'll hunch back over. Nicholas Kemp is an example of this. Kemp is always in his butterfly, but he also shrinks in his butterfly, and he's only 6'1.5" feet tall. So it makes him present poorly, right? Mikhail Yegorov, 6'4" or 6'5", and he's very tall at all times in his butterfly. That's super helpful, right? And then he can micro shuffle or make adjustments in his butterfly, and he just gets into that secondary save in advance, right? So that's something he's very good at doing. What's another? So, okay, one thing we should definitely bring up with Yegorov is the skating base. So skating bases are a bit misunderstood at the position. and well, I mean everything in this, including I'm sure I'm getting things wrong too, but everything goaltending is misunderstood. But one of the there's two components that are very misunderstood that he can correct for. One is that his awareness and evaluations below the goal line are not very good right now. If you look at goalies, though, like James Reimer, when James Reimer was coming up through Toronto's system, he was the worst goalie I've ever tracked at tracking pucks below his net area. Frederick DeCow is another goalie I tracked that also had some of the worst evaluations for low to high danger shots you ever see in their initial draft year, +1, +2. So James Reimer, Frederick DeCow both had the worst hockey sense I've ever seen for detecting low to high danger passing plays from below their net area. Fast forward to their Reimer. Reimer completely corrected for it. Has had a great NHL career. Frederick DeCow is also corrected for it. So it's one of those situations where it's not like forwards or defense. Goalies can absolutely, fundamentally correct their tracking. And now, this is where things get more convoluted and complicated. Just because it's possible doesn't mean every goalie's going to do it. And it's very, very, very tricky to figure out which ones can and can't. Now, so what we have to do then is you look at Mikhail Yegorov and you say, okay, his tracking was really bad in the first half. Has it improved at all? And that's where we thought that there was some improvements, and that's important. The other factor, and the last factor, is the skating base. He has good large area skating. What this means is when he's in a set stance, cutting down an angle, he's top of the blue paint, he can make a T push off to the weak side and get back out in front of the plate easily, fluidly, efficiently, explosively. It's all there. T push offs are good. His micro shuffle rates are also fine. Again, 6'5", super young. They'll come. He won't ever get to Marko Bilic levels, Eemil Vinni levels, but he'll be fine. They'll be passable. Where things get more complicated, more convoluted is the small area skating. So when you look at Mikhail Yegorov's small area skating game, he has a lot of difficulty with his post integration. This is extremely similar to Kim Saarinen. Now, that said, let's go back. Let's look at some of the best skaters in the NHL right now at goaltending position. Two of them, and hint, they're all out of Russia because Russia understands how to develop skating bases the best out of anyone, is that you look at Yuri Shesterkin, you look at Ilya Sorokin. They are phenomenal in their small area skating game. So what I did, I went back, I watched Igor Shesterkin in 16, 17 years of age. You do the same with Sorokin. What do you see? Well, they were raw. They weren't as good as skaters either. So you see the developmental approval in small area skating, which Yegorov has to have. Well, we think it can get there. That the large area skating is already fine. It's not great, but it's passable. We'll keep improving. T push-offs are very good. Micro shuffle rates are fine. Micro adjustment rates are also fine. And it paints a picture of a goalie who's raw, poor high glove, needs a lot of work in all sorts of areas, overlap position, behind the net play, tracking ability, needs all the work in the world on that. His instincts when he gets screened are not great either. They're not great. But then you look at the total package. Freakish athlete in some ways, full extensions, super competitive. And my favorite thing about him, Jérôme, and for our listeners, when he was blown up 6 goals, he was put back out against the same team multiple times this season and stood on his head. That is incredibly important. You weight that just as heavily as the other attributes. This goalie did not get dissuaded. He did not get exposed in the situation he was in where a lot of other goalies would have. He stood on his head after already getting blown up by the same team. That speaks to the mental recalibration that the goalie has, and that's what he needs to be a full-time starter in the NHL. So yes, there's variables you have to take into consideration, but the athletic base is there, and we saw enough improvements throughout the season to think that he can be a full-time starter.
Yeah, and just to finish up on him, he's committed to Boston U, but will not go there next year. We'll go back in the USHL for one more season, which is fine. And obviously Boston U, they have already their #1 goalie who's a senior, so just was not in Yegorov's best interest to go at Boston U next season because maybe the ice time will not be there for him. But when he goes there in his 19 years old season, he's gonna play. If we think he develops like the way we think he is, he's gonna play a lot of games in his real freshman season. So, and now we are with 2 goalies left on the list. Our #2 ranked goalie has been mentioned a bit sometime here and there in that podcast so far, because he's a guy that we talked about last year. Pavel Moysevich from Belarus. He's playing in the SK system in Russia. This year, he played in basically in three leagues, VHL for the most part, second half more in the KHL, and he finished the year in the MHL, playing in the MHL playoff, winning the MHL championship with some guy named Ivan Demidov on his team. So we saw, like I said, we saw this player last year. We had time for him, but the lack of viewings was a bit of a problem, but not a problem, but just a more challenging evaluation with the lack of viewings. But no issue with that this year. He played a lot, played, VHL, KHL, and did really well in the KHL in a few times. I think he played about 11 games, I believe. Um, Another huge goalie, 6'5". Brad, you came up with that player last year, and you wanted me to watch him last year. What was your assessment of his season this year?
Yeah, so Akira Schmid is kind of my stylistic comparison for him. I think they're very similar in a lot of ways, and especially when you look at growth rate and what they're bad at the same age too, where they're good, it's very similar. So yeah, so the big issue with this goalie last year was that he was in four different systems, or sorry, four different teams, two different systems, four different teams. So uh, there was no opportunity. I know for some of you, I'm sure you've seen Dustin Wolf out of Calgary, and he had the worst season he's had over the last 5 years. And the reason isn't just because he came up to the NHL and had to play in a split role occasionally. It's that, or a backup role, I should say. It's that he had to move between systems up and down from the NHL to AHL, NHL, AHL. So what happens is when you have a goalie who constantly has to switch between systems, it can really throw them out of a loop where they can get synced up, calibrated with their defense, get adapted to everything, and just go. Right. So Moysevich is very up and down in his first year of draft eligibility, which was last season. I fell in love with him in his initial with his initial team, which is SKA. I think it's Variagi. He was with Variagi's system. I remember the orange shoulder pads. They're ugly, but I remember the color scheme. So he stood on his head in a couple games there. He stood on his head against SKA's primary team, and then SKA brought him up. So I think that was one of the games where that really got him on the map, even in the SKA system. Like, whoa, we got something. So it's I'm Jerome. I might be totally wrong. Somebody might call me out on this. It might have been Capitan Stepino, because Capitan Stepino and Variagi have similar color schemes sometimes. He might have been in Capitan's system. Then they SK8 saw him and then put him in their system. I can't remember. If you look that up for me, it'd be awesome. But either way, played in four different systems, didn't help our cause. However, 6'4.5", 6'5", a true 6'4.5", 6'5", massive frame, extremely composed, and could make saves he didn't expect him to make. Looks very like blockish in net, almost like a transformer in net, but then he moves better than you think. So that by the end of the year, I was totally on board with him. He was for me the sixth ranked goalie, first C ranked goalie. I would have taken him in the fifth round. So now, don't get me wrong. Does that make up for you the Yegor Zavragan mistake? No, I would take Yegor Zavragan every time over Pavel Moysevich at this stage. However, at least it's something out of a bad situation for me where I missed a Russian, which I don't like to do. So when you look at his game now and you look at his development, what happened? Well, he played not only at the VHL level, he actually got more than a cup of coffee at the KHL level, and he looked exceptional at both the VHL and KHL levels. His game is predicated around the most fundamental aspect of the position right now, and that's his butterfly. This is an elite butterfly style goalie. He presents well. He has an elite butterfly. It's sealed. It's tight. He's always connected within it. So meaning if he stops the first shot, he can laterally transfer while still staying in his butterfly at an exceptional rate to make secondary saves. I highlight this because his weakness is in with his extension rates. For a 6'5" goalie, you would theoretically say to yourself, "Oh, his extensions are going to be excellent." They're not. Mikhail Yegorov or Yegor Yegorov, for instance, Mikhail Yegorov, I'm getting my Yegorovs mixed up. Mikhail Yegorov's extension rates are way better than than Moysevich's, and they're about the same size, right? So again, just because a goalie is similarly tall or wide doesn't mean that they have the same attributes. So what he has to do to compensate for that is overly rely on his butterfly. If a goalie is going to overly rely on their butterfly, you have to see two things. One, you have to see exceptional tracking, so he knows when to actually drop in and out of it, and he has to be able to absorb the first save. You do not want rebound and chaotic play types. You don't want broken play types to materialize around your net area if you're not a great athlete. He's a decent to good athlete, but not a great athlete. So he needs to have that absorption rate within his butterfly in order to be able to hold. It's not so dissimilar to blocking style goalies you see in the NHL recently that have had tremendous amount of success, like Crawford out of Chicago, who won a couple of cups. Reminds me a little bit of him. Connor Hellebuyck has these elements. I even mentioned Connor Hellebuyck as a stylistic comparison for Kirill Zarubin, but Kirill Zarubin is kind of my comparison for Pavel Moysevich in some ways. So, there is some similarities there. And that's the style he presents. Connor Hellebuyck is not an elite athlete. He's elite mentally and then has a fantastic frame. And then the athleticism to hold. And it presents a tremendous goalie, right? So they don't all have to be freaks. They don't all have to be Yaroslav Askarovs. They don't have to be Sebastian Kosas. And that's what Pavel Moysevich isn't. He is none of that. He is refined technically, phenomenally efficient, exceptional butterfly, presents very well, fixed some areas of his game that were not good last year. One of those being his standing post integration, and when he would integrate in his post in either a butterfly or reverse VH, he would do it. It was mechanical. It was like two motions instead of one fluid transfer. He's improved that tremendously. That's expected. He's 6'5". He's very young. I would say that when you look at him in net, just the way he presents, the way he operates, the composure, the ice in his veins, he's the closest to, if you stuck him in an NHL environment, he would have success right now. I think you mentioned Ilya Nabokov for this. You said, hey, maybe because he's older and he's already won a Gagarin Cup, he's already looking in the KHL. Does that accelerate his development to the AHL and then the NHL? Well, I pose the same question for Pavel Moysevich. They both look like the goalies from this class that they can accelerate their development the quickest because of the environments they're in and because of their ages. Now, Nabokov is older than Moysevich, but you look at the style Moysevich plays, you see how he did in the KHL. And to me, I think he'd hold right now in the AHL, no problem. And if you had to call him up, could he hold in the NHL? I think he could. And that's right now. So that's one of the reasons we have him ranked so high as well, is because you're not talking about so much in theoreticals as reality. Right? Hugo Laring and Marko Bilic, even Carter George, you're talking about taking millions of variables in consideration and looking at them from 5 years out. We're projecting 5, 6, 7 years of development. This goalie, you're not. Ilya Nabokov, you're not. But we put Moysevich ahead of Nabokov for one extraordinarily obvious reason. One is 6 feet, the other is a natural 6'5". We're going to take that on the 6'5" every time, regardless of what we think in other areas, as long as they hold, right? As long as the attributes actually hold. So yeah, he's had a great season. He also has no real weaknesses. His glove and blocker were not, neither one was had exploitation. Like one thing I forgot to mention with Marcus Gidlof, I was supposed to. Marcus Gidlof, like Dennis Hildeby, can be exploited low glove, and that makes a lot of sense with a larger goalie, because if you have a longer arm, it's harder to fully extend and close over your pad in time, right? You got more there to move, so it's a slower closing rate, right? This is another issue with Kim Saarinen has this issue. He's a bit shorter, but same issue. And so Gidlof has that, Saarinen has that, Hildeby has that, Pavel Moysevich doesn't. Pavel Moysevich has no issue closing over his pad. Pavel Moysevich's issue are within the extension rate, not the actual extension with his hand, extension with his leg. So there's a lot to like. Really good glove hand as well. And one thing about him from last year is when he was looking through screens and was looking through coverage, he would open himself up a bit, especially when laterally transferring. He wouldn't seal everything tight. Now, completely different. Now he's just sealed at all times. It's so hard to get the first initial shot by him. He can see around screens effortlessly. He's much better at dealing with coverage. He just looks like a bona fide starter to me. I won't be shocked if this is the goalie where we get, like our list, I know publicly to some of you looks absurd. Like I totally get it. But when you look long term, it's like, oh, this is the one where even the NHL kind of thought the way they did. Pavel Moysevich might be the guy. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Pavel Moysevich was the first goalie taken off the board. I wouldn't be shocked. Don't bet. I wouldn't bet on it. But if he's top three drafted, I wouldn't be shocked whatsoever. I wouldn't bat an eye. So yeah, we think of him as a bona fide potential starter. Love his set stance. Love his butterfly. Huge absorption goalie. Kira Schmidt is the play style. Had a tremendous development curve. Played very well this past season in an elite system.
Yeah, just to go back on what you said about last year. Yeah, he did start with Stupino, uh, and then moved to
Okay.
SK
Yeah.
Variargi, and
Reagi,
then
right? Yeah. Yeah. That's
then
why I mixed it
SK
up.
and then
Sorry to our listeners.
And then SK 1946, which is like their top MHL team. And
Top top one.
he
Yeah.
also played four games in the VHL. So that was
Mm,
his season. So he played for
okay.
four different teams and he played 4 or 5 games on each team. So
Yeah.
that was his what his draft draft year season looked like. So very interesting development this year with him being really good in the VHL, being really good in the KHL. Looks like obviously we like him a lot since he's ranked number 2. But we'll see what happens at the draft. I think there's starting to be more and more buzz around his name. Um, and like you said, I don't think he's gonna go like super late in the draft. Moving on to our number one ranked goalie, and this is a goalie that is not ranked by Central Scouting, is not ranked by anybody, basically. Has been not talked about all year, except by us, because we have him ranked in our November, December, January rankings for goalie. Kirill Zarubin. Interesting story for him. So he started the year on the bad team, and that's a bit how we discover him. Was giving up a lot of goals, but was still making a lot of saves. So if you look at his stats line, he was averaging over 4 goals per game, giving up over 4 goals per game, which usually not good. But his save percentage was really good. And that's kind of what, set the alarm of hockeyprospect.com. Like, whoa, let's keep an eye on this kid because there might be something with that goalie. And then he moved, I think, maybe November, maybe, or maybe late mid October, late October, whatever, whenever that was, to a better team, and then we saw the whole potential of that goalie. And he's a first year eligible. He's 6'4". He's a late birthday, so technically for that draft class, he's a bit of an older goalie, but as we said, we don't really care. Um, and so all year, that guy just kept moving up on the list. And I mean, we had him pretty high right from the start, but it's something, Brad, you mentioned. It's like when you like a goalie or even a player and you don't see his name appear anywhere, you're like, am I this genius scout who found a player that is not ranked by anybody, or I'm just completely out of touch with reality? I don't know if we think we're genius scout, but we think we got a really good goalie on our hand here, and really good potential goalie. Um, Another Russian goalie. I lost count how many Russian goalie we have on our list, but it's another proof that Russia knows what they're doing with goalies, and Zarubin is the best of the bunch. We feel so. Brad, what was your take on Zarubin this past season?
Well, I'll start by saying, I remember having a conversation with the director of scouting, and I asked him, how long does it take, or did it take you, where you could actually really go against a consensus and drown out all the noise and actually say, I don't care. Like actually do it. Because we can all say it. We can all say, no,
Hmm.
no, no, nobody affects our rankings. We don't care about noise. We don't care about anything. When you're living on an actual island, when you got to like draw your own Wilson, you got to get out a felt pen and make your own smiley face on a basketball because you are isolated on an island alone and you're trying to do your best Tom Hanks impression, it really can affect you. Because if you get it wrong, it looks really bad. It can look really, really, really bad. I mean, we were the first staff to have Cole Eiserman outside the top 10. The initial feedback wasn't good for you guys. It was, you guys are crazy. That was the initial feedback, right? It's usually not people trying to give you a pat on the back when you do these types of things. That said, I say this because we really do as a staff try to just get it right. We're not trying to look a certain way. We're not trying to differentiate ourselves, be like, oh, look at us. Oh, look what we're doing. No, we have a process. We stick to our process. We've been validated previously by our process. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. I just told all of you, Jakub Skarik's my screensaver. He was my first ranked goalie in 2018. I was confident. I mean, I was a little worried. I was a bit worried about his season. Internationally, he was terrible. I was like, I don't care. 16, he was too good. He'll fix it. You know, it was like Askarov. He'll fix it. He didn't fix it. I'm wrong. Right? Josef Reagan. I should have had him, right? I had Jacob Fowler correct in terms of figuring out the lateral transfer rates and what they would look like and how his growth rate would be determined. I messed it up with Josef Reagan. And they're in the same draft. I have no excuse for that, right? I'm human, is my point, and we're going to get things wrong here. I hope it's not Kirill Zarubin, though, for so many reasons. So, yeah, to Jerome's point, we live on an island. Never seen his name mentioned this season. He started out in AKM Tula's second system. That's a bad team, and that means he had to go Mikhail Yegorov mode and stand on his head, and that's exactly what he did. However, when you see that environment, you say, as a scout, you look at it and you say, okay, what would he theoretically be if he was on a good team? What would his stats look like? How would you expect him? Where would he need to develop? Right when he gets the better you assume with the better goaltending coach, and then that's what happened. We got an opportunity to see him develop in AKM Tula, their main system, decent system, cool jerseys, decent system, and he fixed what he had to, and that was he would occasionally lose his net, and occasionally be susceptible to low danger shots where he would get caught just mentally unfocused. Right, you fast forward now. I think part of that was the shot rates, but you look at him in the better system. Once his crease containment came, well, the rest of the game came with it. Very similar to some ways in Pavel Moysevich. And again, stylistic comparison, Connor Hellebuyck. Very similar. That means the athletic rates are not typically at the top end of this class. It's not Timofei Obvintsev. It's not Mikhail Yegorov levels. Okay, it's not Eemil Vinni in terms of how he fluidly transfers. It's not that. However, it holds. He has good extension rates. He can go post to post cleanly and fluidly, and he's incredibly well-rounded with an exceptional butterfly. Again, it's very rare for a first-year eligible goalie like Moysevich, like Zarubin, to be able to absorb that many pucks in their butterfly, but they do. They absorb everything. They make the game. The best way to describe both of them, especially Zarubin, is that when he's playing well, the game looks easy. He makes high-danger saves look very routine. He makes everything look routine, and that's what you want. You don't want – now, don't get me wrong. I love watching – Jérôme and myself both love watching Eemil Vinni and Timofei Obvintsev go crazy, dynamic saves, highlight reel saves. You're left wanting to watch more because it's so fun. But you don't hate boring, because boring can be exceptionally useful for a goalie. Because boring means they're swallowing everything. They're always in position. There's no chaos. There's no rebound generation that's abnormal, atypical. And that's what you get with Kirill Zarubin. Now, what's really interesting, though, with Zarubin relative to Moysevich, one of the reasons we have Moysevich lower than Zarubin is when you look at the recovery rates, Zarubin should develop into a better goalie long-term relative to Moysevich in terms of that ability. In terms of the recovery rates, that's specific, meaning butterfly save, doesn't absorb it. How fast can he push across in his butterfly, enter a kicking reflexive save and get it, right? How fast can he make a micro adjustment where he can correct for an initial shot that was supposed to go short side, but now it's trickling far side, right? Zarubin trajects at the same age. If I was to take Moysevich the same age as Zarubin holds better than Moysevich. Where it gets super tricky, though, is Moysevich came off an incredible season where his development was unbelievable. Can Zarubin actually catch that level of development next year? Welcome to the I don't know. I have no idea. This is why the position is so difficult to study. I can sit here all day and tell you what their components are and where Moysevich was relative to last year to this season and where Zarubin I think theoretically can get, but we just don't know. That said, we bet on Zarubin because Zarubin has shown better structure and is more developed at the same age. I think that would be the real reason we have him ranked higher. He's an incredibly intelligent goalie, as I mentioned, but he's also dexterous. He can make windmill glove saves. Some of his best saves this season are off of 2-on-1 lateral setups where he has to fly across and get his glove involved. His micro adjustment rates are good. He's very fluid. He's very good with his post play. He's very, very good at knowing how to integrate. Unlike a lot of these goalies in this class, Marcus Gidlof, Kim Saarinen, where the skating's like all over the map and you're extremely worried about how they're going to integrate. Kirill Zarubin's fine. Kirill Zarubin is ahead of them, and I think he'll continue to be. And then, you know, it's just one of those situations where Jerome and myself wish he was a super athlete, because then it's a home run. Then we're not worried. But admittedly, the athleticism, it's good, not great, and therefore it's going to have to get to another level. And if it does, then we're good. If it doesn't, well, this might come back to be a pretty ugly looking podcast, or have to have some discussions as to what went wrong and why we missed. But for our money, Kirill Zarubin's the top goalie in this class, in a very underrated class, and I get it. Listen, I totally get it. First of all, we had like 6 Russians in our top 8, right? So if you don't scout out Russia, you really just don't know. Timofei Obvintsev, I've never seen mentioned. We really think he's a potential starter. You look at the development rate of Ilya Nabokov, Pavel Moysevich. I think a lot of people in this industry honestly just don't know the growth curve of these goalies, and why would they? And it's one of those situations where, yeah, people are going to look at what some people think of the top end of this class, Carter George, Eemil Vinni, and think, well, if that's the best, this isn't very good. We don't think that's the best. That's the difference. That's and don't get me wrong. If you completely disagree with this or think we're out on stranded on an island and we're going to die on that island, that's okay. But we want to give some understanding as to why we have the players where we do, and why we think the draft is much deeper at this position than initially interpreted online. And then you factor in the dark horses. Maybe one of them hits. Hugo Laring, Marko Bilic, Bor Glavic, maybe Nicholas Kemp. One of them might hit, and then the draft gets even deeper. So time will tell. I think it's one of the most interesting drafts I've ever seen in general. And I think the goaltending position as a whole for this draft really summarizes how unique it is. So, yeah, it's been a fantastic year. And I wanted to say thanks to Jérôme, because he's my right-hand man when it comes to goalies. If I'm burnt out or I'm looking at a goalie, I love having him come in as a backup here and be like, oh, this is what I'm seeing. And then sometimes we get to watch them together and pick each other's brains about the position. And that can be super helpful just to keep the energy levels high, because goalies aren't like skaters. You can't put on you got to watch your full games, of course, but with some skaters, if you got 15, 20 games, you can get some shift by shifts. With goaltending, shift by shifts are not going to do anything for you. You got to watch full games, a game after game after game. So I'm glad I got you for the grind, Jerome. It's been a good season.
All right. Well, this will do it for this comprehensive review of this goalie class. I think we're over 3 hours. Well, I want to thank you, Brad, for all your insight. If people didn't know you, you are very, very passionate about goaltending, and if they want to get you going, just talk about goaltenders with you, and you can speak for hours about goaltenders.
Don't you know it? Yeah.
I want to remind people that they can get our black book. If you want a PDF version, you go on hockeyprospect.com. You get it right from the website. Pretty easy download. And if you want the print version, that looks like this. So this is the print version of last year. You go on Amazon Canada, Amazon USA, and yeah, I think that will do it. I want to say thank you for watching or listening. If you're listening on I don't know, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, I would say subscribe to our YouTube channel. We got more content coming up before the draft. And have a good one. Thank you, everyone.